in the rolling hills of Yorkshire, where the River Rye winds through valleys of limestone and green, a Cistercian monastery stands at the edge of a woodland, its stone walls weathered to silver gray by centuries of wind and rain. Brother Edmund tends to the daily rhythms of monastic life, his tasks following the same steady pattern they have held for decades. The year is 1412, and spring has brought longer daylight and the scent of earth turning beneath the plow. Good evening. I am grateful you are here tonight. Tonight's story will carry us to a medieval Cistercian monastery in the year 1412, where we will follow Brother Edmund through the quiet rhythms of his weekly tasks. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. Brother Edmund was 46 years old, with work-roughened hands and close-cropped graying hair that showed silver in the candlelight. His movements held the unhurried quality of someone who had performed the same tasks for so many years that his body knew them without thought. The deep contentment that settled around him like a familiar cloak had been his companion since his earliest days as a novice, and it returned to him now as he made his way through the cloister toward the chapter house. The bells for prime had rung across the valley moments before, their sound drifting through morning mist that clung to the grass. Edmund paused at the entrance to the chapter house, feeling the cool air against his face, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and the faint sweetness of wild herbs growing between the flagstones. Inside, his brothers were already gathering, their white habits moving like clouds in the dim interior. He stepped across the threshold, trading the fresh morning for the warmer atmosphere within. The chapter house held the accumulated heat of many bodies, and beneath that warmth lay the familiar smell of wool and beeswax, of aged wood and the particular mustiness of old parchment kept in cupboards along the walls. Edmund found his customary place along the stone bench that lined the room, settling his weight onto the seat worn smooth by generations of monks. The abbot's voice began the reading from the Rule of Saint Benedict, the Latin words flowing in measured cadence. Edmund listened without strain, his attention resting lightly on the familiar passages. His hands lay folded in his lap, and he noticed the way the morning light, filtering through the narrow windows, cast elongated rectangles across the floor. The warmth of those bright patches seemed almost tangible, a mild heat that contrasted with the coolness of shadow. When the reading concluded, the community began discussing the week's tasks. Edmund's responsibility for the Scriptorium was acknowledged with a nod from the abbot, and he felt the quiet satisfaction that always accompanied recognition of his stewardship. The Scriptorium had been his domain for 12 years now, ever since Brother Anselm had grown too frail to manage the careful oversight required. Edmund had accepted the role with the same steady acceptance he brought to all things, knowing that his patience and attention to detail suited the work well. After chapter, the monks dispersed to their morning labors. Edmund crossed the cloister garth, where dew still silvered the grass despite the advancing morning. His footsteps on the stone path made barely any sound, just the faintest whisper of leather against weathered rock. Above him, the sky was clearing, patches of pale blue appearing between dissolving mist. The Scriptorium occupied a room on the south side of the monastery, positioned to capture the best light throughout the day. Edmund entered through the heavy wooden door, feeling the familiar shift in atmosphere as he stepped inside. Here, the air held the particular smell of oak gall ink, of vellum and parchment, of chalk and pumice used for smoothing writing surfaces. It was a scent he associated with peace, with the absorption that came from careful work. 3 other monks were already at their desks, each bent over his current page. Brother Martin, copying a psalter, sat nearest the window. Brother Thomas, working on a breviary, occupied the middle desk. Young Brother Peter, still learning his letters with deliberate concentration, hunched over practice sheets at the desk farthest from the door. Edmund observed them all with the quiet approval of someone who understood the dedication required for their craft. He moved to his own desk, positioned where he could oversee the entire room while attending to his current project, a copy of St. Augustine's writings. The manuscript before him was nearly complete, requiring only a few more pages of text and the addition of illuminated initials at each chapter heading. Edmund settled onto his stool, adjusted the manuscript to catch the light properly, and reached for his quill. The first stroke of ink on vellum brought the day into focus. His work-roughened hands held the quill with practiced ease, and he felt the familiar rhythm establishing itself. Dip the quill, tap off excess ink, form the letter, move to the next. Each motion flowed into the following one with the smoothness of water finding its path downhill. The scratching of 4 quills filled the room with a gentle susurrus, like wind through dry leaves. Hours passed in this absorbed silence. The light shifted gradually across the floor, marking time more accurately than any sundial. Edmund noticed, without breaking his concentration, when the morning sun moved from illuminating Brother Martin's desk to casting its glow more directly onto his own workspace. The warmth touched his hands as he worked, a comfortable heat that eased the mild stiffness that sometimes gathered in his fingers during cold weather. By the time the bells rang for sext, the midday office, Edmund had completed 2 full pages. He set down his quill, flexed his hands gently, and rose from his stool. His body held the pleasant tiredness that came from hours of focused work, not an exhaustion, but rather a satisfying awareness of effort well applied. He led his fellow scribes from the Scriptorium toward the church, their footsteps creating a soft rhythm on the stone passages. The church was cool and dim after the bright Scriptorium, and Edmund felt his eyes adjust gradually to the reduced light. The scent of incense lingered from the morning's mass, mingling with the smell of cold stone and old wood. He took his place in the choir stalls, his body settling into the familiar posture of prayer with the ease of long habit. Around him, his brothers' voices rose in plain chant, the melodies weaving through the vaulted space above. Edmund added his own voice, a low baritone that blended with the others, creating harmonies that seemed to fill every corner of the building. After sext, the community gathered in the refectory for the midday meal. Edmund walked slowly toward the dining hall, in no hurry, his attention caught by the way sunlight now streamed through the cloister windows, creating patterns of brightness and shadow across the walkway. The herb garden, visible through the arched openings, showed the first tender growth of spring, tiny shoots of green pushing up through dark earth. Inside the refectory, the smell of pottage filled the air, rich with the aroma of barley and beans, seasoned with herbs from the previous year's harvest. Edmund took his seat at the long wooden table, bowing his head for the blessing. The meal was eaten in silence while one of the younger brothers read aloud from the lectern, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. Edmund ate slowly, tasting the simple flavors, feeling the warmth of the food spread through him. The pottage was thick and satisfying, each spoonful containing tender grains and soft vegetables that required little chewing. Edmund found pleasure in the meal's plainness, in the way it filled his belly without demanding attention or causing discomfort. A piece of brown bread accompanied the pottage, its crust firm but yielding, its interior soft and slightly sour from the rye flour. He broke off pieces methodically, using them to soak up the last bits of broth from his wooden bowl. After the meal, the community observed the customary rest period. Edmund returned to his cell, a small chamber containing a narrow bed, a wooden chest for his few possessions, and a small shelf holding a single candle and a cup for water. He lay down on the straw-filled mattress, covered with a wool blanket, and allowed his eyes to close. The sounds of the monastery continued around him. Distant footsteps, the creak of a door, the call of a bird outside his window. But they seemed remote, like sounds heard from underwater. He did not sleep, but rather entered that pleasant state between waking and sleeping, where the mind drifts without urgency and the body releases its accumulated tension. His breathing deepened, became slower, and the deep contentment that was his constant companion spread through him like warmth from a well-banked fire. Time seemed to expand, each moment stretching out languorously, and when the bells rang for none, the afternoon office, it felt as though he had rested for hours rather than the single hour that had actually passed. Edmund rose from his bed, straightened his habit, and made his way back through the cloister. The afternoon sun was lower now, the light taking on a golden quality that softened the edges of everything it touched. He observed a bee moving among the early spring flowers in the garth, its progress from blossom to blossom following some pattern known only to itself. The sight brought a slight smile to his face, the kind of gentle amusement he often felt when watching nature's small dramas unfold. The afternoon in the Scriptorium held the same peaceful rhythm as the morning. Edmund returned to his copying, his quill moving steadily across the vellum. Brother Martin had switched to preparing fresh sheets of parchment, scraping them smooth with a curved blade, the sound a steady, soothing rasp. Brother Thomas worked on illuminating an initial letter, his brush loaded with vermilion pigment, adding tiny strokes of color that built up gradually into intricate patterns. Edmund found his attention settling into the work with even greater ease than before. The rest had refreshed him, and now his hand seemed to move of its own accord, forming letters with barely any conscious direction. He noticed the way each word took shape, the way the ink darkened slightly as it dried, the way his handwriting maintained its consistent character from one line to the next. There was meditation in this repetition, a quality of prayer that required no words, only the steady application of skill to the task. The light began its slow retreat as afternoon advanced toward evening. Shadows grew longer in the Scriptorium, stretching across the floor like dark water rising. Edmund worked by natural light as long as possible, knowing that candles, while necessary, added their own challenges. The flicker could tire the eyes, and the smoke sometimes left a thin film on fresh pages. He continued until the light grew too dim for precision, then carefully cleaned his quill and stoppered his inkhorn. Brother Peter, the youngest scribe, had already set aside his work, his concentration unable to maintain itself for the full day. Edmund approached the young monk's desk, examining the practice sheets with the patient observation that characterized his teaching. The letters showed improvement from the previous week, more consistent spacing, better proportion, fewer blots. He nodded his approval, and Brother Peter's face brightened with quiet pleasure at the recognition. "Your patience is being rewarded," Edmund said, his voice low and even. "Each day brings greater skill, though you may not notice the progress yourself. Keep to this steady practice, and before long, you will be ready for your first manuscript." The young monk ducked his head, accepting the praise with humble gratitude. Edmund felt satisfaction at seeing the encouragement well received. He remembered his own early days of learning, the frustration of forming letters that never quite matched his master's example, the joy when at last his hand learned to obey his intention. Teaching required the same patient attention as copying, the same faith that gradual effort would bring results. The bells for Vespers rang across the monastery grounds, their sound carrying through the windows of the Scriptorium. Edmund led his fellow scribes toward the church once more, their progress through the darkening cloister marked by the soft shuffle of feet on stone. Evening had arrived, bringing with it cooler air and the scent of wood smoke from the kitchen fires. Stars were beginning to appear in the deepening blue above, tiny points of light that seemed to pulse gently in the gathering dark. Inside the church, candles had been lit, their flames creating pools of warm light that pushed back against the shadows. The evening office held a different quality from the daytime prayers, more contemplative, more intimate, as though the darkness itself encouraged inward reflection. Edmund's voice joined with his brothers, chanting the psalms that marked the day's end, and he felt the words settling into him like seeds finding earth. After Vespers came the evening meal, simpler than the midday repast. Bread and cheese, ale, and perhaps a bit of dried fruit when available. Edmund ate without haste, savoring the sharp tang of the cheese, the slight bitterness of the ale, the way the bread's texture varied from crust to crumb. The reader's voice continued from the lectern, but Edmund's attention had turned inward, reviewing the day's work with quiet satisfaction. 2 pages completed, Brother Peter's progress noted, materials well maintained and organized for the following day's labor. The meal concluded, and the community gathered for collation, the evening reading. The abbot selected a passage from the Desert Fathers, stories of early monks who had sought God in the Egyptian wilderness. Edmund listened to tales of silence and solitude, of small miracles and gradual sanctification, and found in them echoes of his own experience. The monastic life, whether lived in the desert or in the Yorkshire Valley, followed the same essential pattern: steady dedication to prayer and work, patience with oneself and others, faith that daily fidelity would bear fruit over time. After collation, the great silence began. The monks would not speak again until after prime the following morning. Edmund welcomed this quietude, finding in it a relief from even the minimal speech of the day. He made his way through the now dark cloister toward his cell, guided by memory and the faint light of stars visible through the open arches. The stones beneath his feet felt cool even through his sandals, and the night air carried scents different from the day's, damper, earthier, tinged with the smoke of banked fires. In his cell, Edmund prepared for sleep. He removed his sandals, loosened his habit slightly, and knelt beside his narrow bed for a final period of private prayer. In the darkness, his prayer took the form not of words but of a quiet offering, the day's work presented to God, gratitude for health and strength, trust in whatever the next day would bring. After a time, he rose and lay down on his bed, pulling the wool blanket over himself. Sleep did not come immediately, but Edmund did not seek it with urgency. He lay in the darkness, listening to the night sounds, the distant hoot of an owl, the settling of the old building's timbers, the faint whisper of wind through the cloister. His work-roughened hands rested on his chest, and he felt the rise and fall of his breathing, steady and deep. The deep contentment that was his baseline state wrapped around him, and gradually, without noticing the exact moment of transition, he passed from waking into sleep. The week continued in this pattern, each day following the rhythm established over centuries. Edmund rose before dawn for vigils, the night office that divided sleep into two periods. He returned to his cell for a few more hours of rest, then rose again with the community for lauds at first light. The cycle of prayer marked time more surely than any clock: lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. The hours dividing day and night into segments devoted to God. Between the offices, work continued. Edmund spent his mornings in the Scriptorium, his afternoons sometimes there as well, sometimes in other tasks as needed. Tuesday brought the weekly chapter meeting where faults were confessed and penances assigned, but these were gentle matters, more about maintaining community harmony than punishing transgressions. Wednesday found Edmund helping in the library, checking manuscripts for damage from damp or insects, a task that required careful attention and patient handling of fragile materials. Thursday afternoon, Edmund was assigned to work in the garden. He welcomed the change from the Scriptorium's sedentary work, feeling his muscles engage differently as he turned earth with a spade, preparing beds for spring planting. The soil was still cool from winter, but here and there he found worms stirring, a sign that the earth was awakening. The physical labor brought its own satisfaction, the kind of tiredness that comes from using the body fully rather than sitting hunched over a desk. By Friday, Edmund was ready to return to his copying. The manuscript of St. Augustine was nearing completion, and he felt drawn to finish it before beginning a new project. He worked with particular care on the final pages, knowing that these last efforts would determine the overall quality of the work. His quill moved across the vellum with the confidence of long practice, each letter formed with precision, each line maintaining the proper spacing. Saturday brought additional tasks: the weekly bath, a luxury compared to many monasteries but prescribed by the Cistercian rule as necessary for health. Edmund waited his turn at the bathhouse, a small stone building near the warming room where water was heated in large cauldrons. When his time came, he lowered himself into the wooden tub, feeling the warmth envelop him. The water was barely more than lukewarm by the time it reached him. Several brothers had bathed before, but it still provided blessed relief to muscles that held the week's accumulated tightness. He washed methodically, using a coarse cloth and a piece of soap made from ashes and rendered fat. The soap smelled of lye and herb, an astringent scent that cleared his head. Afterward, dressed in a clean habit from the weekly laundering, he felt renewed, ready for Sunday's more contemplative rhythm. Sunday differed from other days in its focus on prayer and rest. There was no work beyond essential tasks, tending animals, preparing simple meals, maintaining fires. Edmund attended the offices with particular attention, allowing the prayers and chanting to fill more space in his awareness. During the free hours between services, he walked slowly through the cloister, observing without urgency the way spring was gradually establishing itself. More shoots in the garden, buds swelling on the trees visible beyond the monastery walls, the grass in the garth growing thicker and greener. In the afternoon, he sat in the cloister with a psalter, not reading so much as holding the book, allowing his eyes to rest on the familiar words without strain. The sun, warmer now with each passing day, touched his face through the arcade's arches, and he closed his eyes, simply feeling the light and warmth. Birdsong reached him from the garden, and he noticed, with the observant attention that was one of his 3 defining traits, that the quality of the sound was changing as different species returned from their winter quarters. The week's pattern repeated itself with variations so subtle they might escape notice by someone less observant. Small changes marked the season's progress, daylight lengthening by degrees, temperatures rising incrementally, the angle of sunlight shifting as spring advanced towards summer. Edmund noticed these changes the way he noticed the gradual improvement in Brother Peter's calligraphy, with patient attention that did not demand dramatic transformation but appreciated incremental progress. Monday found him back at his desk with fresh energy, beginning the final chapter of the St. Augustine Manuscript. The work required several days to complete properly, and Edmund settled into it with the knowledge that there was no hurry, that quality mattered more than speed. His hands moved steadily across the vellum, forming words that would last longer than he would, that might be read by monks not yet born, in centuries he would never see. The thought brought him neither melancholy nor pride, only a deep sense of participation in something larger than himself. The Scriptorium connected him to a tradition stretching back centuries, to countless monks who had performed this same work in similar rooms, hunched over similar manuscripts, their hands moving in the same patient rhythm. He was one link in a chain that extended into the past and would continue into the future, and there was profound comfort in that continuity. Tuesday morning arrived with rain, a steady drizzle that darkened the stones and filled the air with the scent of wet earth. Edmund woke to the sound of water dripping from the eaves outside his cell window, a rhythmic pattern that seemed to slow time itself. He rose for vigils, moving through darkness made thicker by clouds obscuring moon and stars, and found his way to the church by memory and the faint glow of rushlight in the cloister passages. The church held a different atmosphere in rain, the stone walls seeming to absorb moisture from the air, creating a coolness that settled into bones and fabric. Edmund's breath made faint clouds as he joined his brothers in the choir stalls, and the plain chant seemed to echo differently in the damp air, the notes carrying a particular clarity. After the office, he returned to his cell and lay listening to the rain, a sound like countless gentle fingers tapping against roof tiles, until sleep claimed him once more. When lauds came with first light, the rain continued, softening the dawn to a gray luminescence that seemed to come from everywhere at once rather than from the hidden sun. Edmund moved through the morning prayers with the same steady attention he brought to all things, then made his way to the refectory for the morning meal. Bread and ale, simple and sustaining, consumed in silence while Brother Stephen read from the lectern, his voice rising and falling with the cadence of Scripture. After prime, Edmund crossed the cloister to the Scriptorium, his sandals growing damp despite the protection of the covered walkway. The rain had found gaps in the roof tiles here and there, creating small puddles on the stone path that reflected the gray sky like scattered mirrors. He stepped around them with care, his work-roughened hands tucked into his sleeves for warmth. The Scriptorium felt particularly welcoming on this wet morning, a dry haven filled with familiar scents. Edmund lit additional candles to compensate for the reduced daylight, placing them carefully where their illumination would help without creating harsh shadows. The candlelight gave the room a warmer quality than usual, a golden glow that pushed back against the gray gloom pressing at the windows. Brother Martin arrived moments after Edmund, water beading on his habit where rain had touched it during the dash from cloister to Scriptorium door. He shook the droplets off with a slight smile, the closest any of them came to commenting on the weather during the hours of work silence. Brother Thomas followed, and finally young Brother Peter, whose hood had been pushed back, leaving his tonsure glistening with rainwater. They settled at their desks without speaking, each monk lighting his own candle and arranging his materials. The sound of the rain became a backdrop to their work, a constant whisper against the windows and roof that somehow deepened the sense of enclosure and safety. Edmund opened his manuscript to the place he had stopped the previous evening and picked up his quill, dipping it into the ink horn with the practiced motion that required no thought. The letters formed themselves beneath his hand, black shapes on pale vellum, each one joining its fellows to create words, sentences, paragraphs. St. Augustine's thoughts on the nature of time flowed from Edmund's quill, and he found himself contemplating the ideas even as he copied them. How time seemed to move differently depending on one's state of mind, how the present moment was always slipping away even as one tried to grasp it. The words resonated with his experience of the morning, of how the rain seemed to slow everything, stretching each minute into something more expansive. Hours passed in this absorbed state. The rain continued without variation, neither intensifying nor diminishing, just maintaining its steady presence. Edmund completed 3 pages before the bells for terce rang, calling the community to prayer. He set down his quill, flexed his fingers, and noticed the way the candlelight made his ink-stained hands look almost bronze in color, the dark stains highlighting every crease and line. The walk to the church required venturing into the rain, and Edmund accepted the baptism of droplets on his face and hands with equanimity. The water was cool but not unpleasant, and it brought with it the smell of fresh rain, clean and somehow green, as though the water carried the scent of growing things with it. Inside the church, the monks' wet habits created a different smell, wool and dampness mingling with the ever-present incense. After terce came the chapter meeting, held in the chapter house, where the community gathered weekly to address practical matters and confess faults. The abbot presided from his stone chair, his aged face serene in the candlelight. Edmund listened as Brother Cuthbert confessed to having spoken unnecessarily during work hours, and Brother James admitted to having taken a second portion of cheese at the evening meal. The confessions were received without judgment, small penances assigned, extra prayers, a day of eating bread and water, meant to gently redirect rather than punish. When the meeting concluded, Edmund was approached by the abbot, who asked in a low voice about the progress of the St. Augustine manuscript. Edmund reported that the work was nearly complete, perhaps 3 more days of copying followed by the addition of illuminated capitals at each chapter heading. The abbot nodded with satisfaction, his eyes, still sharp despite his 68 years, showing approval. They needed the manuscript for the library, he explained, as their current copy was showing its age, the binding failing and some pages damaged beyond easy reading. Edmund returned to the Scriptorium with renewed purpose, knowing that his work served an immediate need rather than simply adding to the monastery's collection. He settled back at his desk and resumed copying, his concentration perhaps even deeper than before. The rain had eased slightly, though it continued in a lighter form, more mist than drops, creating a silvery veil across the windows. Brother Peter, at his practice sheets, made an error and reached for his scraping knife to remove the incorrect letter. Edmund heard the sound and glanced over, observing the young monk's technique. When Peter had finished scraping away the error, Edmund rose and moved quietly to his side, taking the piece of pumice from the communal supplies and demonstrating how to smooth the scraped area so the surface would accept ink evenly again. Peter watched with focused attention, then tried the technique himself, his movements careful and deliberate. Edmund nodded his approval and returned to his own desk. Teaching these small skills brought him satisfaction, the kind that came from passing along knowledge gained through years of practice. He remembered Brother Anselm teaching him the same technique decades ago, the old monk's patient hands showing him how to repair rather than waste precious vellum. The continuity pleased him, knowledge flowing from one generation to the next like water finding its course. By midday, when the bells rang for sext, Edmund had completed another full page. He stood, stretching muscles that had grown tight from hours of hunching over his work, and felt the pleasant ache that came from sustained concentration. The walk to the church took him once more through the misty rain, and he noticed that the temperature had dropped slightly, giving the moisture a sharper edge. The midday office passed in its customary rhythm, the community's voices blending in familiar harmonies. Edmund found his attention drifting occasionally to the sound of rain against the church's high windows, a sound like grains of sand being scattered across glass. He brought his focus back to the prayers without self-recrimination, accepting that the mind wandered and simply redirecting it gently, the way a shepherd might guide a straying sheep back to the flock. The meal that followed sext was particularly welcome on this damp day. The kitchen had prepared a thick pottage rich with early spring greens, young nettles gathered from the edges of the monastery grounds, their sting neutralized by cooking. The greens gave the pottage a slightly bitter flavor that Edmund found invigorating, a taste that seemed to wake up his palate after the morning's plain bread. He ate slowly, chewing thoroughly, aware of the warmth spreading through his belly and radiating outward. During the rest period after the meal, Edmund lay in his cell listening to the rain's continued murmur. He did not sleep, but entered that liminal state between waking and sleeping where thoughts floated freely without direction. Images from the morning's work drifted through his mind, the shape of particular letters, the way ink pooled briefly before being absorbed by vellum, the sensation of his quill moving across the writing surface. These memories had a quality almost like prayer, a contemplation of the simple elements that composed his daily work. When the bells for none rang, Edmund rose and made his way back through the monastery. The afternoon light, such as it was, had taken on a pewter quality, the clouds having thickened rather than dispersed. He returned to the Scriptorium and found the space cooler than it had been in the morning, the dampness having seeped more thoroughly into the stones. He added another small log to the brazier that provided minimal heat, positioning it carefully to avoid creating smoke that might soil the manuscripts. The afternoon's work proceeded with the same steady rhythm as the morning's. Edmund found himself nearing the end of the St. Augustine text, the conclusion approaching with each completed line. There was satisfaction in this approaching completion, but also a twinge of something like reluctance. He had lived with this manuscript for weeks now, had spent hours each day in intimate contact with the text, and finishing it meant letting go of that particular companionship. Brother Thomas, working on his illuminated initial, made a small sound of satisfaction, and Edmund glanced over to see what had pleased him. The letter was taking beautiful shape, a capital A formed from intricate interlacing patterns in red and blue, with tiny flourishes of gold leaf catching the candlelight. Edmund nodded his approval, and Thomas's face showed quiet pride at the recognition. The illumination would take several more days to complete properly, but already its quality was evident. As the afternoon advanced toward evening, the rain finally began to ease, the sound against the windows growing softer and more intermittent. Edmund worked on, his quill moving steadily, carrying him closer to the manuscript's conclusion. The words under his hand spoke of eternity, of how God existed outside time's constraints, seeing all moments at once in a single eternal present. The concept was difficult to grasp fully, but Edmund found comfort in the attempt, in stretching his mind toward understanding, even if complete comprehension remained beyond reach. The bells for Vespers arrived, and Edmund set down his quill with the manuscript so close to completion he could have finished it with perhaps another hour's work. But the offices took precedence over all other tasks, and he rose from his desk without reluctance, knowing tomorrow would bring opportunity to complete what today left undone. He led his fellow scribes from the room, extinguishing candles as they departed, leaving only one burning near the door for safety. The church for Vespers held evenings gathering darkness, candles already lit against the gloom. The rain had stopped entirely now, leaving behind only the sound of water dripping from eaves and trees, a slower, more irregular rhythm than the rain itself. Edmund took his place in the choir and added his voice to the evening prayers, feeling the day's work settling into his bones as a pleasant tiredness. After Vespers came the evening meal, and then collatio, where the abbot read from the lives of the saints. Edmund listened to the story of Saint Benedict himself, of how he had lived in a cave for 3 years, supplied with food by a monk who lowered it on a rope. The image of such solitude struck Edmund as both appealing and challenging. He valued the silence and routine of monastic life, but also found meaning in the quiet companionship of his brothers, the sense of working together toward common purpose. When the great silence began, Edmund welcomed it as always, feeling the absence of speech as a presence in itself, a quietness that had texture and weight. He prepared for bed in his cell, kneeling for his final prayers in darkness broken only by starlight beginning to appear through gaps in the dispersing clouds. The air smelled clean after the rain, washed free of dust, and cooler than it had been that morning. Sleep came easily, his body tired from the day's concentration, his mind peaceful with the deep contentment that was his constant companion. He drifted into dreams that held images of manuscripts and candlelight, of rain falling on stone, of letters forming themselves endlessly across pages that stretched into infinity. Wednesday morning brought clearing skies, the clouds breaking apart to reveal blue between their ragged edges. Edmund woke with anticipation, knowing this was the day he would complete the St. Augustine manuscript. He moved through vigils and lauds with his customary attention, but beneath the prayers ran a current of eagerness that he recognized and accepted without judgment. After the morning meal, he arrived at the Scriptorium to find bright sunlight streaming through the windows, the first strong light in 2 days. The room seemed transformed, every surface gleaming with reflected brightness, the colors of the few illuminated manuscripts on display showing with particular vividness. Edmund lit fewer candles than usual, relying instead on the natural light that flooded the space. He settled at his desk and opened the manuscript to its final pages. Perhaps 2 hours of work remained, possibly less if the words flowed smoothly. He picked up his quill, dipped it in ink, and began the day's copying. The letters formed themselves with what seemed like enhanced clarity, each stroke precise and clean, as though his hand had absorbed something from the previous day's extended practice. Brother Martin was preparing fresh vellum at his station, the scraping blade making its familiar rasp. Brother Thomas had returned to his illumination, his brush loaded with cobalt blue. Young Brother Peter practiced his letters with focused determination, his tongue visible between his teeth as he concentrated. The Scriptorium hummed with quiet industry, each monk absorbed in his particular task, yet all connected by the shared work. The morning passed in what seemed like moments, though Edmund knew hours had elapsed when the bells for terce sounded. He looked up from his desk, surprised to find himself on the very last paragraph of the manuscript, so close to completion that he felt tempted to continue despite the call to prayer, but discipline held firm. The offices always took precedence. He set down his quill and rose, joining his brothers for the short walk to church. After term, Edmund returned to the Scriptorium with the knowledge that within minutes he would complete the work that had occupied him for weeks. He settled at his desk, picked up his quill, and began the final paragraph. The words concluded St. Augustine's meditation on time, bringing the discussion to a resolution that acknowledged mystery while affirming faith. Edmund copied each word with particular care, aware that these final letters would be the last thing a reader encountered, the place where the text released them back into their own present moment. The final sentence ended, and Edmund formed the last period with deliberate precision. He set down his quill and sat for a moment in stillness, looking at the completed manuscript. The pages lay before him, weeks of work made visible, thousands of letters formed by his work-roughened hands. Pride would be inappropriate, but he allowed himself quiet satisfaction. The work was well done, the text accurately copied, the pages clean and unmarred by significant error. Brother Thomas approached, having noticed Edmund's stillness. He looked at the completed manuscript and nodded his approval, then gestured toward his own desk where the illuminated initial awaited. Together, they examined the letter, discussing where gold leaf might be added for additional richness, and Edmund felt gratitude for this companionship, for having someone who understood the particular satisfactions of their craft. The manuscript would need time for the ink to fully dry and set before Edmund could begin adding the illuminated capitals at each chapter heading. This meant the afternoon could be devoted to other tasks, a welcome variation after so many days of sustained copying. The abbot had mentioned during chapter that the library needed attention, and Edmund decided this was an opportune time to address that need. After sext and the midday meal, Edmund made his way to the library, a room adjacent to the Scriptorium but devoted to storage rather than active work. The space was smaller and darker, with shelves lining 3 walls from floor to ceiling, each shelf holding manuscripts in various states of age and preservation. The smell here was stronger than in the Scriptorium. Old parchment and vellum, leather bindings, the particular mustiness that came from paper and organic materials aging together in enclosed space. Edmund began his inspection at the highest shelf, using a wooden ladder to reach the manuscripts stored there. These were among the oldest in the monastery's collection, some dating back more than 2 centuries. He handled each volume with reverence, checking for signs of insect damage, for loose bindings, for pages that might be separating from their stitching. Most were in acceptable condition, though he noted several that would benefit from rebinding before the damage progressed further. The work was slow and methodical, requiring careful attention to detail, exactly the kind of task Edmund found most satisfying. He moved from shelf to shelf, making notes on a small piece of parchment about which manuscripts needed repair, which were in good condition, which might need to be copied before deterioration made them illegible. The afternoon light shifted across the library's single window, marking time's passage while Edmund remained absorbed in his careful examination. By the time the bells rang for none, Edmund had completed perhaps half the library's inventory. His hands were gray with dust despite his care, and his habit had acquired smudges from handling the older volumes. He brushed himself off as best he could, washed his hands in the basin kept for that purpose, and made his way to the church for the afternoon office. The prayers provided welcome respite from the library's close atmosphere, the church's larger space and fresher air clearing his head. Edmund noticed Brother Ambrose coughing during the service, a dry hack that spoke of the spring cold that had been making its way through the community. He made a mental note to check on the infirmary later, to see if Brother Ambrose had been given honey and herbs to ease his throat. After none, Edmund returned to the library and continued his inventory. The lower shelves held more recent acquisitions, manuscripts copied within the last few decades, their vellum still supple, their bindings tight and sound. These required less concern, though Edmund examined them with the same thoroughness he had applied to the older volumes. Among them, he found a copy of Boethius that he didn't remember seeing before, and he paused to page through it, admiring the clear script and wondering which monk had copied it. The afternoon wore on toward evening, the light growing softer and more golden as the sun descended toward the western horizon. Edmund completed his inventory just as the bells for Vespers began to ring, their sound carrying through the library's window with particular clarity. He gathered his notes, extinguished the single candle he had lit to examine the darker corners of the shelving, and made his way toward the church. The evening office held the day's accumulated peace, all the hours of quiet work gathering together in the prayers and chants. Edmund's voice blended with his brother's, creating harmonies that seemed to rise toward the vaulted ceiling and linger there, sound made visible in the candlelight. After Vespers came the evening meal, bread and cheese accompanied by early radishes from the garden, their sharp bite a pleasant contrast to the mild cheese. During collatio, the abbot read from the Rule of Saint Benedict, passages about humility and obedience that Edmund had heard countless times, but which still carried weight and meaning. He listened with the patient attention he brought to all things, finding nuances he hadn't noticed before, the way one might discover new patterns in a familiar landscape viewed from a slightly different angle. The great silence descended, and Edmund moved through the darkening cloister toward his cell. The sky still held some light in the west, a band of pale gold above the monastery walls, but overhead the stars were beginning to appear, tiny points of silver against deepening blue. He paused in the cloister garth to look up at them, feeling the coolness of evening air against his face, smelling the scent of grass and earth that rose from the ground. In his cell, Edmund prepared for sleep with the same methodical care he brought to all his tasks. He knelt for his final prayers, offering the day's work as he always did, grateful for health and strength, trusting in whatever tomorrow would bring. As he lay down on his narrow bed and pulled the wool blanket over himself, he felt the deep contentment settling around him like an embrace. The completed manuscript, the library inventory, the quiet companionship of his brothers, all of it wove together into a tapestry of daily life that required nothing more than his steady attention and patient dedication. Sleep came softly, carrying him into dreams of letters and light, of pages turning in gentle hands, of time stretching forward into years he would never see but which his work would inhabit, a small contribution to something far larger and longer lasting than himself. Thursday morning arrived with birdsong, the dawn chorus ringing across the monastery grounds with the particular intensity that came after rain. Edmund woke to the sound of thrushes and blackbirds, their calls overlapping in patterns that seemed almost conversational. He rose in darkness for vigils, moving through the familiar routine of dressing and making his way to the church, where candlelight flickered against ancient stone and his brothers' voices joined in the night office's solemn chants. After vigils, Edmund returned to his cell but found sleep elusive. The completed manuscript occupied his thoughts, not with anxiety but with a pleasant anticipation of beginning the illumination work. He lay listening to the birds greeting the approaching dawn, their songs growing more varied and numerous as light began to seep into the eastern sky. When the bells rang for lauds, he rose feeling refreshed despite the abbreviated rest, his body having learned long ago to thrive on the broken sleep pattern of monastic life. The morning prayers held special beauty on this clear day, sunlight beginning to stream through the church's high windows even before the office concluded. Edmund watched dust motes dancing in the beams of light, tiny particles made visible by the brightness, and found himself contemplating how much existed that remained invisible until the right conditions revealed it. The thought seemed relevant to his work, how his copying made the thoughts of minds long silent, bringing them forward through time to be encountered again. After the morning meal, Edmund went directly to the Scriptorium, eager to begin the day's work. The St. Augustine manuscript had dried sufficiently overnight, the ink now set firmly into the vellum, ready for the addition of illuminated capitals. He had planned 5 such letters, one for each major section of the text, and he began by carefully marking where each would be placed, leaving space at the beginning of each section for the enlarged initial. The work required different materials than simple copying. Edmund assembled his supplies with care, small pots of pigment ground from minerals and plants, gold leaf stored between sheets of parchment, brushes of varying sizes made from squirrel hair, and a binding medium to mix with the pigments. Each item was precious, some having traveled from distant lands through trade routes that connected the monastery to the wider world. He began with the first capital, a letter I that would head the opening section. The shape was relatively simple compared to the more elaborate letters he would create later, but it still required precision. Edmund sketched the letters outline lightly with a lead point, checking the proportions against the text script to ensure harmony between the illumination and the surrounding writing. When satisfied with the sketch, he began applying color, starting with a base layer of red ochre. The pigment, mixed with binding medium to the consistency of heavy cream, flowed from his brush onto the vellum with surprising ease. Edmund worked slowly, building up the color in thin layers rather than applying it thickly all at once. This technique, taught to him by Brother Anselm years ago, produced richer, more luminous color and reduced the risk of the pigment cracking or flacking as it dried. Each layer required time to dry before the next could be applied, so Edmund worked on the initial for a while, then set it aside and turned to other tasks while it dried. Brother Martin was copying a psalter at his desk, his quill moving with steady rhythm. Brother Thomas continued work on his own illumination, now adding delicate gold leaf to the letters' intricate patterns. Young Brother Peter practiced drawing decorative flourishes, his tongue between his teeth in concentration, his hand moving with increasing confidence. The Scriptorium held its customary atmosphere of focused quiet, broken only by the scratch of quills and the occasional rustle of pages being turned. Edmund used the drying time to review materials and supplies, checking ink levels, examining quills for wear, counting sheets of prepared vellum. This mundane inventory work required less concentration than illumination, allowing his mind to rest while his hands remained occupied. He found a rhythm in the task, moving from one supply box to another, making notes about what needed replenishing, what could wait, what was in good supply. The bells for terce arrived, and Edmund set aside his inventory to join the community for prayer. The walk to the church took him through the cloister where morning sun now illuminated the eastern arcade, creating sharp contrasts of brightness and shadow. He paused briefly to observe a spider's web stretched between two pillars, the silk strands made visible by dew drops that caught the light like tiny crystals. The beauty of it, so intricate, so temporary, so perfectly suited to its purpose, brought a slight smile to his face. The office passed in its established rhythm, and afterward Edmund returned to the Scriptorium to continue the illumination. The first layer of red ochre had dried, and he applied a second coat, building up the color's intensity. While that dried, he began work on the second capital, a letter A that would require more elaborate decoration. He sketched its outline, planning to incorporate a simple vine pattern along the letter's diagonal stroke, with small leaves emerging at regular intervals. The morning advanced toward midday, sunlight shifting across the Scriptorium floor as the earth turned beneath the sun's steady gaze. Edmund worked with deep absorption, moving between the two illuminations as drying times allowed, occasionally pausing to examine Brother Thomas's work or check on Brother Peter's progress. The young monk was improving steadily, his flourishes becoming more confident, his understanding of proportion and balance growing through practice. When Sext arrived, Edmund had completed the base layers for both illuminations and was pleased with their progress. He washed his brushes carefully in a small bowl of water, then dried them on a cloth, reshaping the bristles to maintain their points. The pigments were stoppered and returned to their storage box, the gold leaf covered again with its protective parchment. Everything in its place, everything tended with care. This orderliness was as much a part of the work as the illumination itself. The midday meal featured fresh bread still warm from the morning's baking, its interior soft and yielding, its crust making a satisfying crunch when broken. Edmund chewed slowly, tasting the grain's subtle sweetness, feeling the texture change as the bread mixed with saliva. A thick slice of cheese accompanied the bread, along with ale that had a slightly fruity flavor, suggesting the barley had been harvested at optimal ripeness. He ate without haste, aware of the simple pleasure that came from satisfying hunger with good food. During the rest period, Edmund lay in his cell thinking about the illuminations yet to be completed. 3 more capitals awaited him, 2 letters C and 1 letter E. The letter E offered a particular opportunity for decoration, its 3 horizontal strokes providing spaces that could be filled with pattern or color. He envisioned a design using blue and gold, perhaps with small red accents at the terminals. The image formed itself in his mind with increasing clarity, and he found himself eager to return to the work. But rest took precedence, and Edmund allowed his body to relax fully, releasing the mild tension that accumulated in shoulders and neck from hours of hunching over work. His breathing deepened and slowed, and he entered that peaceful state between waking and sleeping, where thoughts drifted without urgency or direction. The bells for none seemed to arrive both suddenly and after a long interval, time having behaved in its peculiar way during rest. The afternoon in the Scriptorium brought continued work on the Illuminations. Edmund returned to the first capital I, now ready for its final layers and details. He mixed a brighter red vermilion ground from cinnabar and applied it to the letter's center, creating a gradation from the darker ochre at the edges to the brilliant red at the core. The effect gave the letter depth and richness, making it appear almost three-dimensional on the flat page. While the vermilion dried, Edmund began work on the vine pattern for the letter A using a fine brush and green pigment mixed from verdigris. He painted delicate leaves along the diagonal stroke, each leaf slightly different from its neighbors, but all maintaining a family resemblance. The work required intense concentration, each brushstroke needing to be precisely placed, and Edmund found himself holding his breath during the most delicate moments, releasing it only when each leaf was complete. Brother Thomas approached during the afternoon to examine Edmund's progress, and they stood together looking at the Illuminations with the quiet satisfaction of craftsmen appreciating work well done. Thomas pointed out how the vine leaves on the A echoed a similar motif in his own illumination, and they discussed the way such patterns created visual connections between different manuscripts, establishing a house style that identified work from their scriptorium. The conversation was brief, conducted in low voices that didn't disturb the other working monks, but it carried warmth and mutual respect. As afternoon advanced toward evening, Edmund completed the vine pattern and began preparing gold leaf for application to the letter I. Working with gold required particular care. The leaf was extraordinarily thin, so delicate that breath could send it floating across the room. Edmund cut a small piece from the larger sheet, using a knife to separate it gently, then transferred it to a piece of parchment for easier handling. The area where gold would be applied needed special preparation. Edmund mixed a sizing medium, a sticky substance that would hold the gold in place, and carefully painted it onto the portions of the letter I that would receive gilding. The sizing needed to reach precisely the right consistency, tacky but not wet, and Edmund waited patiently for it to achieve that state, testing it occasionally with a clean finger. When the sizing was ready, Edmund lifted the gold leaf on his knife blade and positioned it over the letter. With a gentle breath, he released the gold, watching it settle onto the sizing. Using a soft brush, he pressed the gold into place, then carefully brushed away the excess. What remained was a brilliant line of gold that caught the afternoon light and seemed to glow with inner fire. The transformation was remarkable. The letter that had been merely red and white now held this element of precious metal, lifting it from ordinary into something approaching sacred. Edmund sat back to observe his work, feeling the quiet satisfaction that came from seeing materials and skill combine to create beauty. This was why he loved illumination even more than simple copying, the way it allowed him to add something beyond words, to create visual beauty that drew the eye and invited contemplation. The bells for Vespers rang across the monastery grounds, their sound carrying through the scriptorium windows with particular clarity. Edmund covered his work carefully, protecting it from dust or accidental disturbance, then led his fellow scribes toward the church. The evening was settling gently over the valley, the western sky still holding light, but the eastern horizon already showing the deep blue that preceded full darkness. Inside the church, candles were being lit, their flames multiplying until the space glowed with warm light. The evening office held its customary rhythm, prayers and chants marking the transition from day toward night. Edmund's voice joined with his brother's, the familiar words requiring no conscious thought, allowing his mind to rest in the repetition while his body stood in its accustomed place. After Vespers came the evening meal, simpler than middays, bread and ale, a bit of dried fruit reconstituted in water, some early spring greens dressed with vinegar and salt. Edmund ate mindfully, noticing flavors and textures, grateful for nourishment that sustained his body's work. The reader's voice flowed from the lectern, but Edmund's attention had turned inward, reviewing the day's accomplishments with satisfaction. 2 illuminations well advanced, gold successfully applied, good progress made. Collatio followed, the abbot reading from Gregory the Great's pastoral care, passages about the responsibility of those who teach and guide others. Edmund listened with particular attention, finding relevance to his own role supervising the Scriptorium and teaching young Brother Peter. The words emphasized patience, the recognition that different people require different approaches, the importance of matching instruction to capacity. These principles aligned with Edmund's own understanding, and hearing them articulated by so respected an authority brought confirmation and encouragement. When the great silence began, Edmund walked slowly through the cloister toward his cell, in no hurry, allowing the transition from activity to rest to occur gradually. The night air carried a coolness that hinted at the season's lingering connection to winter, though spring was establishing itself more firmly with each passing day. Above, stars were appearing in increasing numbers, their ancient light reaching across vast distances to touch this small monastery in its Yorkshire valley. In his cell, Edmund knelt for his final prayers, offering gratitude for the day's work, for hands that remained steady and eyes that still saw clearly enough for fine detail, for the privilege of working with beautiful materials to create something that would outlast him. His work-roughened hands rested together, and he felt the deep contentment that was his baseline state settling through him like warmth from a well-tended fire. Sleep came easily, his body tired from the day's concentration, his mind peaceful with the satisfaction of work progressing well. He dreamed of gold leaf floating like autumn leaves, of letters growing into vines that spread across pages, of light that seemed to come from within the manuscripts themselves, illuminating the darkness with gentle radiance. Friday morning brought fog, a thick blanket that obscured everything beyond a few yards' distance. Edmund woke to whiteness pressing against his cell window, the world reduced to immediate surroundings, all distance erased. He rose for vigils and moved through fog so dense it seemed almost tangible, moisture condensing on his habit and face as he crossed the cloister. The church emerged from the whiteness like a ship from clouds, its stone walls darker where moisture had settled on them. The morning offices proceeded as always, their rhythm unaffected by weather. After lauds and the morning meal, Edmund made his way to the Scriptorium, where fog pressed against the windows like a living presence. The room's interior seemed even more enclosed than usual, a small island of light and warmth in a world shrunk to its immediate boundaries. Edmund found comfort in this enclosure, this sense of the Scriptorium as a protected space separate from external conditions. He resumed work on the illuminations, beginning with the third capital. One of the letters C, this letter offered a pleasing curve that Edmund decided to emphasize with a border pattern, a series of small circles connected by lines, creating a chain that followed the C's arc. He sketched this pattern lightly, checking that the circles were evenly spaced and properly sized, then began filling them with alternating colors, red and blue, creating a rhythm that the eye could follow around the letter's curve. The work required steady hands and careful attention, but Edmund found it deeply satisfying. Each circle needed to be perfectly round. Each connection between circles needed to be centered and straight. Perfection was probably impossible, but the attempt to approach it brought its own rewards. He worked slowly, building up colors in thin layers, allowing adequate drying time between applications, his patience as much a tool as his brushes and pigments. Brother Martin had completed his Psalter and was showing it to Brother Thomas, the two monks examining the finished work with evident satisfaction. Edmund glanced over and nodded his approval. The script was clean and consistent, the page layouts well proportioned, the overall effect pleasing to the eye. Martin would now begin binding the pages together, a skill Edmund himself had never fully mastered, preferring to focus on the writing and illumination while others with better aptitude for leather work handled the binding. Young Brother Peter approached Edmund's desk during mid-morning, carrying his practice sheets. Edmund set down his brush and examined the young monk's work, noting continued improvement, more consistent letter formation, better spacing, fewer errors requiring correction. He looked up at Peter's eager face and nodded slowly, then spoke in the low voice appropriate during work hours. "Your diligence is bearing fruit," Edmund said, his tone warm with approval. "I believe you are ready to begin your first manuscript. Nothing too ambitious, perhaps a copy of one of the shorter epistles. We will start you on that next week." Peter's face lit with joy, and he ducked his head in grateful acknowledgement before returning to his desk. Edmund watched him go, remembering his own excitement at being judged ready for his first real manuscript after months of practice. The moment marked a transition from student to craftsman, even if only at the most junior level. Peter would remember this day for years to come, just as Edmund still remembered Brother Anselm's pronouncement decades ago that he was ready to move beyond practice sheets. The morning advanced toward midday, the fog outside beginning to thin as the sun's heat penetrated it. By the time the bells rang for sext, visibility had improved to perhaps 50 yards, and by the time Edmund returned from the midday office and meal, the fog had lifted entirely, revealing a world washed clean and bright. The sudden expansion of visible space felt almost disorienting after hours of fog-limited vision, and Edmund paused in the cloister to simply look at the revealed landscape. The hills beyond the monastery walls, the trees showing their early spring green, the sky now perfectly blue and cloudless. The afternoon brought continued work on illuminations. Edmund completed the border pattern on the third capital and moved to the fourth, another letter C that he planned to execute in a simpler style, a solid letter in brilliant blue with gold terminals at each end. The contrast between the elaborate third capital and this simpler fourth would create visual interest, preventing the decorated initials from becoming monotonous in their similarity. He mixed ultramarine, a pigment ground from lapis lazuli imported at great expense from distant mountains in the east. The blue was so intense it almost hurt to look at directly, a color that seemed to contain depth and luminosity beyond what mere pigment should possess. Edmund applied it to the letter with reverent care, aware of the material's value, grateful that the monastery's resources allowed access to such precious substances. While the blue dried, Edmund worked on the final capital, the letter E he had envisioned earlier. He began with a framework of gold, applying sizing, and then leaf to create the letter's basic structure. When the gold was burnished to maximum brilliance, he added details in red and blue, small geometric patterns filling the spaces within the letter's form, creating complexity without clutter. The work absorbed him completely, his awareness narrowing to brush and pigment, to the precise placement of each tiny shape. Hours passed unmeasured, marked only by the shifting light and the eventual ringing of bells for none. Edmund stood and stretched, feeling his spine release accumulated tension, his shoulders dropping away from where they had crept upward during concentration. He looked at the 5 capitals now in various stages of completion and felt satisfaction at the progress made. Perhaps one more full day of work would see them finished, with time afterward for any necessary corrections or refinements. The afternoon office provided welcome movement after hours of sitting, and Edmund walked briskly to the church, feeling energy moving through his limbs. The prayers flowed past him while his mind continued partly occupied with the illuminations, planning the next day's work, envisioning the finished manuscript as it would appear when all elements were complete. He brought his attention back to the present moment gently, without self-criticism, accepting that the mind pursued its own paths even during prayer. After none, Edmund returned to the Scriptorium for the final hours of work before Vespers. He applied finishing touches to the first 2 capitals, adding fine details in gold and adjusting colors where they seemed unbalanced. The work was minute now, requiring the finest brushes and the most careful placement of each tiny stroke. His eyes tired more quickly at this detailed work, and he paused frequently to rest them, looking out the window at the distant hills or simply closing his eyes and breathing deeply. Brother Thomas stopped by Edmund's desk to admire the illuminations, and they stood together examining the work. Thomas pointed out a small inconsistency in one of the vine leaves, and Edmund nodded thanks for the observation, making a note to correct it. This collegiality, this shared investment in quality and beauty, was one of the aspects of Scriptorium work Edmund valued most. The way individual monks labored separately but remained connected through common purpose and mutual support. The bells for Vespers brought the work day to its close. Edmund covered his work carefully, cleaned his brushes thoroughly, and returned all materials to their proper storage. The Scriptorium was left tidy and orderly, ready for the next day's labors. He walked to the church through late afternoon light that had taken on the golden quality particular to spring evenings, when the sun's angle created a specific warmth of color and quality of illumination. The evening office, the meal, collatio, all proceeded in their established pattern. Edmund moved through each element with full attention, yet part of him remained aware of the illuminations waiting in the Scriptorium, of the work yet to be completed, of the satisfaction that would come when the manuscript was finally finished and ready for the library. This anticipation was gentle rather than urgent, adding flavor to the present moment rather than pulling him away from it. In his cell, after the great silence descended, Edmund knelt for his final prayers with particular gratitude. The work was going well, his hands remained capable, his eyes still functioned adequately for the detailed work. These were gifts not to be taken for granted, especially as he moved through his 46th year. He had known scribes whose hands had developed tremors, whose eyes had failed, forcing them to leave work they loved for other tasks. That such afflictions had not yet touched him was cause for humble thankfulness. Sleep came peacefully, carrying him into dreams where gold and color flowed like water, where letters grew and transformed into living things, where beauty emerged from patient attention and careful work, and where time itself seemed to slow and thicken into something that could be held and shaped like clay beneath skilled hands. Saturday morning arrived with birdsong and a gentleness in the air that spoke of spring settling more deeply into the land. Edmund woke before the bells for vigils, lying in the darkness and listening to the pre-dawn chorus building outside his window. The sound held a richness now, more voices joining each day as migratory birds returned from their winter quarters. He recognized the liquid notes of a song thrush, the cheerful repetition speaking of territory claimed and the season's possibilities. He rose and dressed in the familiar darkness, his hands knowing without sight where each element of his habit resided, how the fabric folded and fastened. The walk to the church took him through air that held a mildness absent even a week earlier, and he noted this change with the observant attention that was one of his defining traits. Spring was arriving not as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual accumulation of small shifts: warmer air, longer daylight, more birdsong, green things pushing through earth. The night office proceeded in its timeless pattern, voices raised in darkness to greet God before dawn. Edmund found particular meaning in this practice of waking to pray while most of the world slept, of offering the day's first moments to something beyond himself. When vigils concluded and he returned to his cell, sleep came easily for the remaining hours before lauds, his body having long since adapted to this division of night into segments. Morning light brought Saturday's particular quality, a day that felt slightly different from the week's other days, carrying with it the anticipation of Sunday's more contemplative rhythm while still holding work obligations. After lauds and the morning meal, Edmund made his way to the Scriptorium with the knowledge that today he would complete the manuscript's illuminations. The final details awaited him, perhaps 4 or 5 hours of concentrated work, and then the project would be finished. The Scriptorium held its customary morning coolness, not yet warmed by bodies and candles. Edmund lit his workspace carefully, positioning candles to provide clear illumination without creating harsh shadows. He settled at his desk and uncovered the manuscript, examining yesterday's work with fresh eyes. The colors had dried well, maintaining their intensity, and the gold leaf showed no signs of flacking or lifting, always a concern with gilding work. He began with the simplest remaining task, adding final touches to the letter C with its chain of circles. A few spots needed additional pigment where the coverage seemed thin, and he applied these corrections with a fine brush, building up the color patiently. When satisfied with the result, He moved to the more complex letter E, adding delicate gold flourishes to its terminals and refining the geometric patterns within its form. The work required his complete attention, each tiny brushstroke potentially visible to anyone who examined the finished manuscript. Edmund worked with the patience developed over decades, never hurrying, always willing to pause and consider before making a mark. His work-roughened hands held the brush with surprising delicacy, the calluses and stains no impediment to precision. If anything, the marks of labor made his hands more sensitive, more aware of pressure and angle. Brother Martin was beginning the binding process on his completed psalter, working at a separate table with leather, thread, and wooden boards. The smell of leather added itself to the Scriptorium's usual scents, a rich organic aroma that Edmund found pleasant. Brother Thomas continued on his own illumination, now adding the finest details with a brush so fine it contained perhaps only 3 or 4 hairs. Young Brother Peter had been given new practice sheets, copying a brief prayer repeatedly to perfect his script before beginning his first manuscript next week. The morning advanced steadily toward midday, marked by the bells for trees that called the community to prayer. Edmund set down his brush and stretched, feeling mild stiffness in his neck from hours of bending over the manuscript. The walk to the church provided welcome movement, his legs grateful for the change from sitting. The spring air touched his face with what felt almost like warmth, and he paused in the cloister to observe new growth in the herb garden, tiny shoots of mint and thyme showing green against dark earth. After terce came the weekly chapter meeting, where practical matters were discussed and faults confessed. The abbot announced that Sunday would bring visitors, the prior from a sister monastery 20 miles distant, traveling with 2 companions to discuss matters of mutual concern. This news generated quiet interest among the community, as visitors brought word from the wider world, stories and information from beyond their valley's boundaries. Brother William confessed to having felt impatience during the previous day's work, to having rushed through a task in his eagerness to finish it. The abbot received this confession with kindness, reminding William that haste served neither God nor the work, that patience was itself a form of prayer. Edmund listened with sympathy, understanding the temptation to rush, grateful that his own temperament inclined naturally toward patience. When the meeting concluded, Edmund returned to the Scriptorium and resumed his illumination work. The letter E was nearly complete, needing only a few final touches, some additional gold in one corner, slight adjustment to a geometric pattern that seemed unbalanced. He worked with intense focus, aware that these final details would determine the overall quality of the finished piece. Perfection remained impossible, but approaching it as closely as skill allowed was both duty and desire. By the time the bells rang for sext, Edmund had completed all 5 illuminations. He sat back to examine the manuscript as a whole, turning pages slowly, assessing the visual rhythm created by the decorated capitals appearing at intervals through the text. The variation in their styles prevented monotony while maintaining overall harmony. Some elaborate, some simple, all executed with care and attention to beauty. He felt deep satisfaction looking at weeks of work now complete, ready to take its place in the monastery's library. The midday meal featured barley bread with a coarser texture than wheat, more filling and substantial. Edmund chewed thoroughly, aware of the grain's nutty flavor, the way the bread's density satisfied hunger more completely than lighter breads. A thick slice of cheese accompanied it, aged long enough to develop sharp complexity. An ale that had a slight sweetness suggesting honey had been added during brewing. He ate with gratitude, aware that this simple food sustained the work he loved. The afternoon rest period found Edmund in his cell, lying on his narrow bed with a sense of completion surrounding him like a comfortable blanket. The manuscript was finished. In a few days, after final checking for any errors or necessary corrections, it would be bound and placed in the library, ready for brothers to consult when studying St. Augustine's Meditations on time. His contribution to that chain of transmission, from Augustine's original thought, through countless scribes over centuries, now including his own work, felt both humble and significant. Sleep came during the rest period, brief but deep, and when the bells for none rang, Edmund woke feeling refreshed. The afternoon held different tasks. Saturday's schedule included preparation for Sunday's observances, and Edmund had been assigned to help prepare the church for the visitors' arrival. This meant checking that all was in order, that candles were adequate, that the space showed the care and attention befitting a house of prayer. He made his way to the church after none and found Brother Cyprian already there, sweeping the floor with long, steady strokes. Edmund joined him, taking a cloth to dust the choir stalls, wiping away the week's accumulation of dust from the carved woodwork. The task was simple, requiring little thought, and Edmund's mind drifted peacefully while his hands worked. He thought about the visitors arriving tomorrow, wondered what news they might bring, what discussions might occur between the abbots. The church held afternoon light that streamed through the high windows in solid-looking beams, dust motes dancing in the brightness. Edmund paused in his dusting to simply look at this light, at the way it transformed the stone interior, creating warm pools of illumination that contrasted with cool shadows. Beauty appeared in unexpected places when one paid attention, not only in illuminated manuscripts but in light and shadow, in the grain of old wood, in stone worn smooth by centuries of touch. Brother Cyprian worked silently nearby, the whisper of his broom a steady rhythm that required no conversation to accompany. Edmund appreciated this comfortable silence, this ability to work alongside another without need for speech. The great silence that descended each evening had trained them all in finding companionship that didn't require words, in communicating through gesture and presence rather than constant talk. When the church was clean to satisfaction, Edmund and Brother Cyprian stood together examining their work. Everything appeared in order, floor swept, woodwork dusted, candles checked and replaced where necessary, altar linens freshly laundered and precisely arranged. The space held a quality of readiness, of welcome prepared for tomorrow's visitors and Sunday's more elaborate observances. The bells for Vespers rang, and Edmund made his way through the cloister where late afternoon sun created long shadows. The evening office held particular beauty on Saturday evenings, a sense of the week completing itself, of time turning towards Sunday's different rhythm. Edmund's voice joined with his brothers in the familiar chants, the harmonies rising toward the vaulted ceiling where they seemed to linger before fading into silence. After Vespers came the evening meal, and then Saturday's special observance, the weekly bath. Edmund waited his turn at the bathhouse, grateful that he was relatively early in the rotation tonight, meaning the water would be warmer than for those who bathed later. When his turn came, he entered the small stone building where steam rose from wooden tubs, carrying with it the scent of herbs that had been added to the water, lavender and rosemary, their fragrance both cleansing and calming. He undressed and lowered himself into the tub, feeling warmth envelop him completely. The water came to mid-chest, and he sat still for a long moment, simply allowing heat to penetrate muscles that held the week's accumulated tension. His work-roughened hands floated on the water's surface, the ink stains visible even through the slight cloudiness created by soap and herbs. Those stains were marks of his vocation, visible signs of the work that gave his life meaning and structure. Edmund washed methodically, using a coarse cloth to scrub away the week's accumulation of sweat and dust. The soap was harsh but effective, cutting through grime, leaving skin feeling raw but clean. He ducked his head under the water to wet his close-cropped hair, then scrubbed his scalp vigorously before rinsing. The ritual of washing held meaning beyond mere hygiene. It was a physical manifestation of the spiritual cleansing sought through prayer and confession, a reminder that body and soul both required tending. When finished, he dried himself on a rough linen towel and dressed in a clean habit that smelled of the sun and wind in which it had dried after laundering. The transformation from dirty to clean, from old habit to fresh one, created a sense of renewal, of starting again. He emerged from the bathhouse into evening air that felt cool against his damp skin, refreshing after the bathhouse's humid warmth. Collatio followed, the abbot reading from the conferences of John Cassian, discussing the different types of prayer and contemplation. Edmund listened with attention, finding in the ancient text descriptions that matched his own experience. The way prayer sometimes felt like words offered consciously, other times like wordless attention, still other times like simple presence before mystery. The text affirmed that all these forms were valid, that prayer took many shapes across a life lived in devotion. When the great silence descended, Edmund walked slowly to his cell through darkness now complete, the monastery settling into its nighttime quiet. Above, stars showed with particular brilliance, the spring sky having been washed clean by recent rains. He paused to look up at them, feeling the familiar sense of his own smallness in the face of such vastness, yet also feeling held within something larger and more meaningful than himself. In his cell, Edmund knelt for his final prayers with particular gratitude. The manuscript was complete, the work well done. Tomorrow would bring visitors and Sunday's contemplative rhythm. But tonight, there was only this moment, this simple offering of the day back to its source, this trust that whatever came next would be met with the same patient attention he brought to all things. His work-roughened hands rested together, and the deep contentment that was his constant companion spread through him like warmth. Sleep came gently, carrying him into dreams of light streaming through windows, of pages turning in careful hands, of time flowing like a river that carried everything forward while remaining always itself, constant, patient, inexhaustible in its steady progression toward an end that was also, somehow, a beginning. Sunday morning arrived with bell music that seemed more elaborate than weekdays, the ringers having added variations in honor of the day's significance. Edmund woke to this sound, lying for a moment in the pre-dawn darkness to simply listen. The bells spoke in multiple voices, some deep and resonant, others higher and brighter, all weaving together in patterns that were both planned and spontaneous, structure and improvisation combining to create beauty. He rose for vigils and found the church prepared with additional candles, their flames multiplying the light until the space seemed to glow from within. The night office proceeded with the same texts and melodies as always, yet Sunday lent everything a quality of heightened attention, as though the familiar words revealed depths not visible on ordinary days. Edmund felt this deepening as he chanted, his voice blending with his brother's to create harmonies that seemed to come from some source beyond their individual throats. After vigils, Edmund returned to his cell but found sleep difficult. Anticipation of the visitor's arrival occupied his thoughts, not with anxiety but with a pleasant curiosity about what news they might bring, what stories might emerge from conversation between the two communities. He lay watching the window gradually lighten, tracking dawn's arrival through the changing quality of darkness. And when the bells rang for lauds, he rose feeling alert despite the abbreviated rest. The morning office held Sunday's particular solemnity, the community's voices raised in praise and thanksgiving. Sunlight was streaming through the eastern windows by the time the prayers concluded, creating bars of brightness that illuminated dust motes and made the air itself seem visible. Edmund filed out with his brothers toward the refectory, where the morning meal would be slightly more elaborate than weekdays in recognition of Sunday's special character. Fresh bread accompanied the usual porridge, and there was honey available to sweeten it, a luxury not offered on ordinary days. Edmund drizzled honey over his porridge, watching it pool in the bowl's center before stirring it through, creating swirls of gold in the gray barley. The sweetness was welcome, a small celebration expressed through taste. He ate slowly, grateful for this gift, mindful that such abundance was not available to all, that his life held comforts many lacked. After the meal came the primary Sunday Mass, more elaborate than weekday services. The community processed into the church in formal order, and Edmund found his place in the choir stalls with the others. Incense filled the air, its smoke rising in visible streams through the beams of sunlight, creating patterns that shifted and dissolved and reformed. The scent, frankincense mixed with myrrh, was rich and complex, adding olfactory beauty to the visual splendor of candles and sunlight, vestments and polished vessels. The Mass proceeded through its ancient pattern, words and gestures that had been repeated countless times over centuries, connecting this moment to all other moments when the same ritual had been enacted. Edmund participated fully, his responses automatic from long practice, allowing him to attend to the deeper currents beneath the surface actions. The consecration brought particular focus, the moment when ordinary bread and wine became, through mystery, something more than themselves. When Mass concluded, the community dispersed for the morning's free time, a few hours when monks could pursue individual interests, walk in the grounds, or simply rest. Edmund chose to walk, feeling the need for movement after hours of sitting and standing in church. He made his way through the cloister and out into the monastery grounds, following a path that led toward the orchard where fruit trees were showing their early spring blossoms. The orchard held a quality of quiet celebration, the trees covered in delicate white and pink flowers that released subtle fragrance into the air. Edmund walked slowly between the rows, observing individual blossoms with the attentive eye he brought to illuminated manuscripts. Each flower was perfect in its construction, petals arranged in precise patterns, stamens rising from centers, colors shading from pure white to the faintest pink. That such beauty existed briefly, would fall in a matter of days, made it no less worthy of attention. If anything, the transience added poignancy. He found a place to sit at the orchard's edge, on a low stone wall that marked the boundary between cultivated and wild land. From here he could see the monastery buildings below, their stone walls catching morning sunlight, and beyond them the valley stretching toward distant hills. The view encompassed both human construction and natural landscape, the monastery fitting into its setting as though it had grown there rather than being built by human hands. Edmund sat without urgency, allowing time to pass unmarked, his mind quiet and at rest. Birds moved through the orchard trees, investigating blossoms for insects, their songs creating a backdrop of sound that required no analysis or response, just awareness. The sun warmed his face. The stone wall beneath him held coolness from the night, and these sensations existed together without contradiction. Warmth and cool, light and shadow, stillness and movement all present simultaneously. The bells for terce brought him back from this contemplative state, and he rose from the wall to make his way back to the church. His body felt relaxed, his mind refreshed by the time spent in simple observation. The office passed peacefully, and afterward came word that the visitors had been sighted on the road approaching the monastery. Edmund joined other monks gathering in the courtyard to welcome them, the community's hospitality expressed through this formal greeting. The prior and his two companions arrived on horseback, their mounts showing signs of the journey, mud-spattered legs, foam at bits, sides heaving slightly from effort. Stable hands moved forward to take the horses while the visitors dismounted with visible relief. The prior was an older man, perhaps 60 years old, with a weathered face that spoke of decades lived in dedication to his vocation. His companions were younger, one appearing to be in his 30s, the other barely 20. The abbot greeted the visitors with warmth, and the two leaders embraced in the customary manner. Words of welcome were exchanged, formal yet genuine, and then the visitors were led inside to be shown their quarters and given the opportunity to refresh themselves after the journey. Edmund watched this reception with quiet interest, noting the visitors' travel-worn appearance, their evident gratitude for welcome after miles on the road. The visitors would join the community for the midday meal, and preparations had been made to provide food more varied than usual. Not a feast, as the Cistercian rule forbade such excess, but an acknowledgement of hospitality through slightly better provisions. Edmund made his way to the refectory with the others when the bells rang for sext, finding his customary place at the long table, while the visitors were seated near the abbot at the head. The meal began with prayer, and then food was served: barley bread, a stew of beans and vegetables enriched with bits of salt pork, cheese, and ale. The reader's voice flowed from the lectern as always, But Edmund noticed that even during the reading, small gestures passed between the abbot and the visiting prior, nods of agreement, slight smiles at shared understanding. These two men clearly knew each other well, their monastery's proximity creating bonds through years of occasional contact. After the meal came afternoon free time, and Edmund returned to the Scriptorium not to work, but simply to check that all was in order. The room was empty, everyone taking advantage of Sunday's looser structure to pursue rest or contemplation. Edmund stood at his desk looking at the completed St. Augustine manuscript, feeling satisfaction at seeing it finished, ready to take its place in the monastery's library. He turned pages slowly, examining the illuminations with a critical eye. Small imperfections showed themselves, a place where gold leaf had lifted slightly, a geometric pattern that didn't quite align perfectly, a color that seemed slightly less vibrant than intended. But these flaws didn't diminish the overall quality. The manuscript was good work, would serve its purpose well, and would carry St. Augustine's thoughts forward to future readers. That was enough. Edmund covered the manuscript carefully and left the Scriptorium, making his way back outside into afternoon sunlight. The day had warmed considerably, achieving a mildness that invited leisure rather than activity. He walked without destination, following his feet rather than any planned route, and found himself near the fish ponds where monks tended carp and other fish that supplemented the community's diet. Brother Oswald was there, feeding the fish from a bucket of scraps. Edmund stood watching as the water's surface erupted into activity, fish rising to snatch at the food, their scales catching sunlight in brief flashes of silver and gold. The simple scene held beauty in its vitality, in the fish's eager movement, in the way Brother Oswald scattered food with practiced economy, ensuring even distribution. When the feeding was complete, Brother Oswald noticed Edmund and nodded greeting. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the pond's surface gradually calm, the fish's movements becoming less frantic as hunger was satisfied. Eventually, Oswald moved on to other tasks, and Edmund remained by the pond, observing water striders skating across the surface, their shadows visible on the pond's bottom where sunlight penetrated the shallow edges. The bells for none interrupted his contemplation, and Edmund made his way to the church for the afternoon office. The visitors were present, their voices adding new tones to the community's customary harmonies. After the office, the abbot announced that the visiting prior would speak to the community during collation that evening, sharing news and reflections from his own monastery. This announcement generated quiet interest. Such sharing helped maintain connections between houses, preventing isolation, reminding each community that they were part of a larger whole. The afternoon stretched toward evening in a pleasant haze of leisure and rest. Edmund spent time in his cell, not sleeping but simply lying on his bed, allowing thoughts to drift without direction. The week's work was complete, tomorrow would bring new tasks, but this moment existed outside that pattern, a suspension of the usual rhythms, time given over to rest and restoration. When Vespers arrived, Edmund walked to the church through late afternoon light that seemed almost liquid in its golden quality. The evening office proceeded with particular beauty, voices raised in gratitude for the week completed, for rest given, for the continuing cycle of prayer and work that structured their lives. After Vespers came the evening meal, simple as always despite the visitors' presence. The Cistercian rule not varying its standards for guests, treating all meals with the same simplicity. Then came collation, and the visiting prior rose to address the community. He spoke of his own monastery's recent experiences, a difficult winter with heavy snows that had tested their preparations, a young monk who had shown remarkable skill in manuscript illumination, news from the wider church about councils and decisions being made far away. His voice was warm and engaging, carrying news that connected this valley to the larger world beyond its boundaries. Edmund listened with the patient attention he brought to all things, grateful for this window into other lives, other places. The prior's words reminded him that the work they did here, copying manuscripts, maintaining prayer rhythms, living in community, was mirrored in countless other monasteries across the Christian world. They were part of something vast, their individual contributions small threads in an enormous tapestry being woven across time and space. When the visiting prior concluded his remarks, the abbot thanked him, and then the great silence descended. Edmund walked to his cell through darkness complete except for starlight, the night clear and cool. In his cell, he knelt for his final prayers, offering gratitude for the day's gifts, rest, contemplation, connection with visitors, the simple beauty of spring unfolding. His work-roughened hands rested together, and the deep contentment that was his constant companion wrapped around him like a well-worn cloak. Sleep came easily, his body tired from the day's activities despite their gentle nature, his mind peaceful with Sunday's particular quality of rest. He dreamed of orchards in bloom, of manuscripts being copied in countless rooms by countless hands, of time flowing like water that carried everything forward while remaining essentially unchanged, patient, steady, inexhaustible in its capacity to hold all moments, past and present and future, in its endless current. Monday morning arrived with the sound of rain beginning again, a light patter that whispered against the roof tiles and created a gentle rhythm in the darkness. Edmund woke to this sound, recognizing it even before full consciousness returned, and he lay for a moment simply listening. The rain held no urgency in its falling, just a steady persistence that spoke of spring's need for moisture, of the earth receiving what it required for continued growth. He rose for vigils and moved through the darkness toward the church, rain touching his face with cool fingers as he crossed the brief open space between cloister and sanctuary. Inside, the church held its familiar dimness, candles creating pools of warm light that pushed back against the surrounding dark. The night office proceeded in its timeless pattern, and Edmund's voice joined with his brothers, the words of ancient psalms carrying the same meaning they had held for centuries of repetition. After vigils, Edmund returned to his cell and lay listening to the rain, which had intensified slightly, becoming more insistent without losing its peaceful quality. Sleep came again, brief but sufficient, and when the bells rang for lauds he rose feeling rested. The dawn was arriving slowly through heavy clouds, the light taking on a gray quality that seemed to soften all edges, making the world appear gentler, less defined. The morning meal was consumed in the usual silence, the reader's voice flowing from the lectern while rain continued its steady percussion against the refectory's high windows. Edmund ate his porridge slowly, tasting the barley's earthy flavor, feeling the warmth spread through him. After the meal came prime, and then the week's work pattern reasserted itself. Sunday's contemplative interlude gave way to Monday's return to routine tasks. Edmund made his way to the Scriptorium with anticipation of beginning a new project. The St. Augustine manuscript was complete, awaiting only final review before being sent to the bindery. Today would bring the selection of his next work, and he felt the pleasant sense of possibility that came with such beginnings. In the Scriptorium, Brother Martin was already at his desk, beginning preparations for a new Psalter. Brother Thomas continued work on his ongoing Illumination project. Young Brother Peter sat with fresh parchment, ready to begin his first manuscript, a copy of one of St. Paul's shorter epistles, as Edmund had promised. Edmund approached the young monk's desk first, carrying the example from which Peter would copy. He placed the book carefully where Peter could see it clearly, then spoke in a low voice, mindful of the work's silence. "Copy with patience," Edmund said, his tone gentle but serious. "Speed will come with practice, but accuracy must be present from the beginning. Better to complete 3 good lines in an hour than 10 flawed ones. Your eyes and your example and your hand must work as one." Peter nodded, his face showing both eagerness and nervousness. Edmund understood both emotions, the excitement of beginning real work, the fear of failing to meet expectations. He placed a hand briefly on Peter's shoulder, a gesture of encouragement and confidence, then moved to his own desk to consider his next project. The abbot had mentioned needing a new copy of the Benedictine rule, their current manuscript being more than a century old, its pages showing wear from constant consultation. This would be Edmund's next work, a text he knew intimately from daily readings and decades of living by its precepts. The familiarity would make the copying easier in some ways, as he could anticipate the text's flow, yet harder in others, as such familiarity sometimes led to inattention, to the eye seeing what it expected rather than what was actually written. Edmund retrieved the monastery's current copy of the rule from its place of honor in the library, handling it with particular reverence. The manuscript was indeed showing its age. The binding was loose. Several pages had tears at their edges. The vellum had darkened with time and handling. Yet it remained legible, its script clear despite being in an older style than current fashion dictated. He carried it carefully back to the Scriptorium and placed it on his desk, then began preparing fresh pages for the new copy. The preparation work was meditative in its own way, checking that vellum was properly scraped and smoothed, cutting pages to size, ruling lines that would guide his script. Edmund worked methodically, his work-roughened hands performing these familiar tasks with unconscious competence. The sound of rain continued as backdrop, occasionally intensifying, sometimes diminishing, but never stopping entirely. It created an atmosphere of enclosure, of the Scriptorium as a protected space where careful work proceeded regardless of weather's variations. By the time the bells rang for a long time, Edmund had prepared a dozen pages, enough to begin copying after the office. He set aside his preparation work and joined the procession to the church, where rain had created small puddles in the cloister that reflected the gray sky like scattered fragments of mirror. The office passed in its customary rhythm, and Edmund found his attention caught by one of the psalm verses, "Be still and know that I am God." The words seemed particularly relevant to his morning's work, to the patient preparation that preceded all meaningful creation. After term, Edmund returned to the Scriptorium and took up his quill for the first time on this new project. He dipped it in ink, tapped off the excess, and formed the opening words of the Benedictine rule. "Listen carefully, my son, to the Master's instructions." His hand moved with the confidence of long practice, creating letters that were consistent in size and spacing, each one flowing naturally into the next. The copying proceeded smoothly, Edmund's familiarity with the text allowing him to work at a steady pace without sacrificing accuracy. He completed the prologue and moved into the first chapter, which discussed the different kinds of monks. The words passed through his eyes and hand without his needing to fully engage his conscious mind. They were so deeply known that the copying became almost automatic, his body performing the work while his awareness rested in a state of peaceful absorption. Hours passed unmeasured except by the shifting quality of light through the windows. The rain continued, sometimes heavier, sometimes lighter, creating a varying soundtrack that Edmund registered without fully attending to. Brother Martin's quill scratched steadily at his psalter. Brother Thomas's brush moved with delicate precision over his illumination. Young Brother Peter worked with intense concentration, his face close to his page, his tongue visible between his teeth as he formed each letter with painstaking care. When the bells rang for sext, Edmund looked up with slight surprise, having been so absorbed in the copying that time had seemed to compress. He set down his quill and flexed his fingers, nodding with satisfaction that he had completed several pages of good, clean script. The work was progressing well, establishing the rhythm that would carry the project forward over coming weeks. The midday office provided welcome movement, and Edmund walked to the church feeling the mild stiffness that came from hours of sitting. The rain had eased to a fine mist that barely qualified as precipitation, more a thickness in the air than distinct drops. Inside the church, the prayers flowed past him while his mind continued partly occupied with the copying, already anticipating the afternoon's work, the next chapters that awaited transcription. The meal that followed next featured bread and a thick soup of lentils and onions, seasoned with herbs that released their fragrance in the steam rising from each bowl. Edmund ate slowly, aware of warmth and flavor, grateful for food that sustained the body's work. The reader's voice continued from the lectern, but Edmund found his attention drifting, his mind returning repeatedly to the manuscript waiting in the Scriptorium, to the satisfaction of steady progress on meaningful work. During the rest period, Edmund lay in his cell thinking about the Benedictine rule, about how its wisdom had shaped his life for more than 2 decades. The text he was copying contained principles that governed everything from the community's prayer schedule to how guests should be received, from the qualities needed in an abbot to how possessions should be distributed. Living by these guidelines had given his life structure and meaning, had channeled his natural patience and attention to detail into forms that served both himself and the community. Sleep did not come during the rest period, But Edmund rested nonetheless, his body relaxed, his mind drifting peacefully. When the bells for none rang, he rose feeling refreshed and made his way back to the Scriptorium. The afternoon brought continued copying, his quill moving steadily across page after page, the familiar words of the rule taking form beneath his work-roughened hands. Brother Peter completed his first page during the afternoon, and Edmund examined it carefully when the young monk brought it to him for inspection. The script showed promise. Letters were reasonably consistent, spacing was adequate, and while there were a few minor errors, none serious enough to require correction. Edmund nodded his approval, and Peter's face brightened with relief and pleasure. "Well done," Edmund said quietly. "Continue with this same care. Remember that each page builds on the last. The consistency you establish now will serve you through the entire manuscript." Peter returned to his desk with renewed confidence, and Edmund felt satisfaction at having offered encouragement that was both truthful and helpful. Teaching brought its own rewards, different from but complementary to the satisfactions of his own work. He watched the young monk settle back into copying, then returned his attention to his own manuscript. The afternoon advanced toward evening, light gradually fading as the sun descended behind clouds that had thickened again. Rain resumed, heavier than before, drumming against the windows with increased intensity. Edmund worked by candlelight now, the natural illumination having become insufficient for fine work. The candle flames wavered occasionally in drafts, creating subtle movements of light and shadow across his page. When the bells for Vespers rang, Edmund had completed several more pages, the work flowing with pleasing steadiness. He covered the manuscript carefully, cleaned his quill, and prepared the Scriptorium for the next day's work. The walk to the church took him through rain that had intensified further, drops striking his face and hands with enough force to be felt distinctly. Inside the church, the community's wet habits created a particular smell, wool and moisture combining with the ever-present scent of incense and stone. The evening office proceeded in its familiar pattern, voices raised in prayer and praise. Edmund's voice blended with his brother's, the words of Vespers marking the day's transition from work toward rest. After the office came the evening meal, and then collatio, where the abbot read from the Desert Fathers, stories of monks who had lived centuries ago in Egyptian wilderness, their dedication and wisdom still relevant across the span of years. Edmund listened with quiet attention, finding in these ancient stories echoes of his own experience. The struggles described, with distraction, with impatience, with the challenges of community life, were not so different from what he himself encountered. That monks separated by 1,000 years and thousands of miles could share such similar experiences spoke to something fundamental about human nature, about the universal challenges of pursuing a contemplative life. When the great silence began, Edmund walked to his cell through rain that showed no signs of diminishing. The monastery grounds were dark, the usual starlight obscured by clouds, and Edmund moved by memory and feel, his feet knowing the path without need for vision. In his cell, he prepared for sleep with the same methodical care he brought to all tasks, removing his sandals, loosening his habit, kneeling for final prayers in the darkness. His prayers that night took the form of gratitude, for the day's work progressing well, for young Brother Peter's successful beginning, for the simple pleasure of copying words that had shaped his life, for rain that would nourish spring's growth, for the deep contentment that remained his constant companion through all variations of circumstance. His work-roughened hands rested together, and he felt peace settling through him like warmth spreading from a well-tended fire. Sleep came despite the rain's noise, his body tired from the day's concentration, his mind peaceful with the satisfaction of meaningful work accomplished. He dreamed of words flowing like water, of letters forming themselves into rivers that carried meaning across time, of manuscripts being read by hands not yet born, in times he would never see, all connected by the patient work of copying that preserved and transmitted wisdom across generations. Tuesday morning brought clearing skies, the rain having passed during the night, leaving behind puddles that reflected pale dawn light and air that smelled fresh and clean. Edmund woke before vigils, lying in the darkness and listening to birdsong that seemed particularly enthusiastic after the previous day's rain. The thrushes and blackbirds sang with what sounded like celebration, their voices carrying clearly through the cool morning air. He rose and made his way to vigils, stepping carefully around puddles in the cloister, feeling the dampness that remained in the air despite the rain's cessation. The night office proceeded in the church's familiar dimness, and afterward Edmund returned to his cell for the brief remaining sleep before lauds. The rest was deep and dreamless, and when the bells rang again, he woke feeling fully restored, ready for the day's work. After lauds and the morning meal, Edmund arrived at the Scriptorium to find sunlight streaming through the eastern windows, the first strong light in 2 days. The room seemed transformed by this brightness, every surface gleaming where moisture had settled overnight. Edmund opened windows to allow air circulation, letting in cool morning freshness that would gradually warm as the day advanced. He settled at his desk and uncovered the Benedictine Rule manuscript, examining yesterday's work with the critical eye that morning light facilitated. The pages were clean and clear, script consistent, no errors visible that required correction. Satisfied, he picked up his quill and resumed copying where he had left off, entering the section of the rule that discussed the divine office, the prayer schedule that was structured each day. The copying proceeded with the same smooth rhythm as the previous day, Edmund's hand moving steadily across the vellum. Around him, the Scriptorium hummed with quiet industry, Brother Martin's quill scratching at his psalter, Brother Thomas's brush adding delicate touches to his illumination, young Brother Peter continuing his epistle with focused determination. The community of craftsmen working in absorbed silence created an atmosphere of shared purpose, each monk contributing to the monastery's mission of preserving and transmitting knowledge. By mid-morning, Edmund had completed the chapter on the divine office and moved into the section discussing the abbot's qualities and responsibilities. He found himself contemplating these words more deeply than usual, perhaps because copying required closer attention than simple reading. The text emphasized that an abbot must be patient, must teach more by example than words, must adapt his guidance to each monk's individual capacity and need. These were principles Edmund tried to apply in his own supervision of the Scriptorium, and reading them now felt like receiving confirmation and encouragement. The bells for terce arrived, and Edmund set down his quill to join the community for prayer. The morning had warmed considerably, the sun having burned off the last remnants of dampness, and the walk to the church was pleasant, air mild and birds singing from trees that showed increasingly full foliage. Spring was asserting itself more definitively with each passing day, the season's transition from potential to actuality becoming more apparent. After there came unexpected news. Brother Ambrose, the infirmarian, sent word that he needed Edmund's assistance with an inventory of the infirmary's herb supplies. This request was unusual but not unprecedented. Edmund's careful attention to detail made him useful for such tasks when the infirmarian needed help. Edmund informed Brother Martin that he would be absent from the Scriptorium for the next few hours, then made his way to the infirmary building. Brother Ambrose greeted him with a tired smile. The spring cold that had affected several monks had kept him busy, and weariness showed in his face. He explained that he needed to take inventory of dried herbs, tinctures, and other medicinal supplies, checking what needed replenishing before summer's harvest season. Edmund nodded understanding and began the methodical work of counting and recording, moving through the infirmary's storage area with the same patient attention he brought to manuscript work. The infirmary held different scents than the Scriptorium, herbs both fresh and dried, creating a complex mixture of fragrances. Edmund identified lavender, rosemary, chamomile, feverfew, and dozens of others, each with its particular aroma and healing properties. He counted carefully, noting quantities on a wax tablet that Brother Ambrose would later transfer to permanent record. The work was simple but required accuracy, and Edmund found satisfaction in contributing to the community's health and well-being through this different form of service. By the time the bells rang for sext, Edmund had completed the inventory, and Brother Ambrose thanked him with genuine gratitude. Edmund returned to the Scriptorium briefly to check on the other monks' progress, then joined the community for the midday office and meal. The afternoon brought his return to copying, and he settled back into the work with the ease of resuming a familiar rhythm after brief interruption. The Benedictine rule manuscript continued to grow beneath his hands, page after page of careful script accumulating into chapters and sections. Edmund worked steadily through the afternoon, pausing occasionally to rest his eyes or flex his fingers, but generally maintaining concentration that seemed to exist outside normal time. The work absorbed him completely, his awareness narrowing to quill and ink and vellum, to the words taking form letter by letter. Young Brother Peter completed another page during the afternoon and brought it to Edmund for inspection. This second page showed improvement over the first. Letters were more consistent, spacing more even, confidence more apparent. Edmund praised the progress genuinely, seeing in Peter's development a reflection of his own early learning, remembering Brother Anselm's patient encouragement decades ago. "You are finding your rhythm," Edmund observed, his voice warm with approval. "Each page teaches your hand what your mind already knows. Continue this steady practice, and before summer arrives, you will be working with real confidence." Peter returned to his desk with visible pleasure, and Edmund watched him settle back into copying with renewed energy. Teaching brought satisfaction that complemented his own work, the sense of contributing not just manuscripts, but also craftsmen who would continue the tradition long after he himself could no longer hold a quill. The afternoon advanced toward evening, and Edmund continued copying until the light began to fail. He had completed significant progress on the rule, perhaps a quarter of the entire text now transcribed. At this pace, the manuscript would be finished in 3 or 4 weeks, ready for binding and placement in the library where it would serve the community for decades, perhaps generations. When Vespers rang, Edmund covered his work and led the other scribes toward the church. The evening was settling gently over the monastery grounds, the western sky still holding light, but the eastern horizon already showing deepening blue. Inside the church, candles were being lit, their flames creating warmth that pushed back against gathering darkness. The evening office proceeded in its familiar pattern, voices raised in prayer and praise, the day's work offered back to its source. After Vespers came the evening meal, and then collatio, where the abbot continued reading from the Desert Fathers. Edmund listened with the patient attention he brought to all things, finding in these ancient stories wisdom that remained relevant across centuries. When the great silence descended, he walked to his cell through darkness now complete, stars showing with particular brilliance in the clear sky that had followed the previous day's rain. In his cell, Edmund knelt for his final prayers, offering gratitude for the day's varied work, copying, inventory, teaching, all of it contributing to the community's life and mission. His work-roughened hands rested together, ink stains visible even in the dim light of a single candle, and he felt the deep contentment that was his constant companion wrapping around him like a familiar blessing. Sleep came easily, his body tired from the day's activities, his mind peaceful with the satisfaction of steady progress on meaningful work. He dreamed of herbs and manuscripts, of words and healing, of all the different ways that patient attention and careful work contributed to something larger than individual effort, a community dedicated to prayer and service, to preserving wisdom and caring for those in need, to living according to principles that had guided countless monks across the centuries. The week continued in this pattern, each day following the rhythm established over generations: prayer and work, silence and song, individual effort and communal purpose, all woven together into a tapestry of daily life. Edmund moved through the hours with steady dedication, his copying progressing page by page, his supervision of the Scriptorium maintaining standards of quality and care, his life a living embodiment of the rule he was transcribing. Wednesday brought more sunshine, the weather having settled into a pattern of clear days that allowed spring to advance unimpeded. Edmund's manuscript grew steadily, the Benedictine rule taking form beneath his patient hand. Thursday found him reaching the midpoint of the text, and he paused briefly to examine the accumulated pages with quiet satisfaction. Good, clean work that would serve its purpose well. Friday afternoon, as Edmund was copying a section about humility, he became aware that his own work embodied the principles being described. The patient attention, the willingness to serve without seeking recognition, the dedication to quality for its own sake rather than for praise. These were forms of humility expressed through craft rather than words. The realization brought a slight smile to his face, a moment of gentle self-awareness that deepened rather than disrupted his concentration. Saturday brought the weekly rhythm of preparation for Sunday, cleaning, bathing, the sense of the week completing itself, and turning toward the day of rest. Edmund's manuscript had progressed significantly, perhaps half complete now, with the remainder awaiting the coming week's steady attention. Young Brother Peter had completed 5 pages of his epistle, each showing improvement over the last, the young monk's confidence growing visibly with each day's practice. Sunday arrived with its particular quality of contemplative rest, and Edmund moved through the day's extended prayer services with full attention, allowing the work week to recede and the deeper rhythms of devotion to come forward. The completed portion of the Benedictine Rule manuscript rested in the Scriptorium, waiting for Monday's resumption of work, patient as the rule itself, its words preserved and transmitted through careful copying that connected past to present and both to future still unfolding. In the evening, as the great silence descended, and Edmund walked to his cell through darkness filled with stars, he felt gratitude for the life he had been given, for work that brought satisfaction, for community that provided support, for the steady rhythm of prayer and labor that structured each day, for the deep contentment that remained his constant companion through all circumstances. His work-roughened hands, stained with ink and marked by decades of holding quills, were instruments of service, tools through which ancient wisdom was preserved and transmitted forward into time yet to come. And in his cell, as sleep claimed him gently, Edmund dreamed of manuscripts being copied in countless rooms across countless years, each scribe contributing to an endless chain of transmission, each careful page a small act of faith that meaning could be preserved, that wisdom could be carried forward, that patient work performed with love and attention would bear fruit in ways seen and unseen, in his own time and in times beyond his knowing. The new week began with Monday morning arriving in mist, a thick blanket that softened all edges and muffled sound. Edmund woke to whiteness pressing against his cell window, the world reduced once more to immediate surroundings, all distance erased. He rose for vigils and moved through fog so dense that the church seemed to materialize from nothingness as he approached, its stone walls emerging gradually from the surrounding white. The night office proceeded in its timeless pattern, voices rising in darkness to greet God before dawn. Edmund found particular meaning in this practice during fog, the way the exterior world's invisibility seemed to mirror the interior focus of prayer, attention turned inward rather than outward. After vigils, he returned to his cell and lay listening to the silence that fog created, a quality of quiet that felt almost tangible, and sleep came easily in this cocoon of stillness. When lauds arrived with first light, the fog remained thick, the dawn coming as a gradual brightening of white rather than the appearance of sun and color. Edmund moved through the morning prayers with his customary attention, then proceeded to the refectory for the morning meal. The porridge was particularly warming on this damp morning, its heat spreading through him, and he ate slowly, grateful for simple nourishment that sustained the body's work. After prime, Edmund made his way to the Scriptorium, his sandals growing damp from moisture that had settled on every surface during the night. Inside, he lit additional candles to compensate for the reduced visibility, creating a warm glow that pushed back against the fog's gray presence. He settled at his desk and uncovered the Benedictine Rule manuscript, examining the previous week's work before resuming where he had stopped. The copying proceeded with its established rhythm, Edmund's quill moving steadily across the vellum, forming letters that composed words, words that composed sentences, sentences that composed the wisdom of Saint Benedict. He had reached the section discussing prayer and found himself contemplating the relationship between the words he was copying and the life he was living. How prayer was not separate from work, but interpenetrated with it. How this careful copying was itself a form of prayer, attention and devotion made visible in ink on parchment. Brother Martin worked at his psalter, now nearly complete after weeks of steady effort. Brother Thomas had finished his illumination and was preparing materials for a new project. Young Brother Peter continued his epistle with increasing confidence, his hand moving more fluidly across the page than it had the previous week, muscle memory beginning to establish itself through repetition. The morning advanced toward midday, the fog outside showing no signs of lifting. Edmund worked by candlelight, the flames creating a small circle of brightness within which his manuscript existed. The Scriptorium felt particularly enclosed, a protected space where careful work proceeded regardless of weather's variations. This sense of shelter, of being held within something stable while external conditions changed, brought Edmund a quiet satisfaction that deepened his concentration. When the bells rang for fear, he set down his quill and stretched, feeling the familiar tightness in his shoulders release. The walk to the church took him through fog that had, if anything, grown thicker, visibility reduced to perhaps 10 yards. Other monks emerged from the whiteness like ghosts, their habits making them seem to float rather than walk. Inside the church, the gathered community created warmth and presence that contrasted with the fog's isolation, and Edmund felt gratitude for this daily gathering. These moments when solitary work gave way to communal prayer. After term, Edmund returned to the Scriptorium and resumed copying. The Benedictine Rules section on prayer gave way to chapters discussing daily manual labor, and Edmund found himself smiling slightly at the appropriateness. Here he was, engaged in manual labor of a particular kind, copying words about the necessity and dignity of such work. The text emphasized that idleness was the enemy of the soul, that monks should be occupied at certain times with manual work and at other times with sacred reading. His own life embodied this balance, copying being both manual work and a form of engagement with sacred texts. The afternoon brought a subtle change in the fog's quality, not lifting, but becoming slightly more luminous, as though the hidden sun was asserting its presence despite remaining invisible. Edmund worked on, his quill scratching steadily, Brother Martin's similar sound creating a counterpoint rhythm. The two scribes had worked together for so many years that their presence had become a form of companionship that required no words, just the shared understanding of craftsmen pursuing similar work. Young Brother Peter made an error during the afternoon, a word copied incorrectly, requiring scraping away and correction. Edmund heard the sound of the scraping knife and glanced over, observing Peter's careful work to remove the mistake without damaging the vellum beneath. When Peter had finished and reached for pumice to smooth the surface, Edmund rose and approached, taking the opportunity to reinforce the lesson he had taught weeks earlier. "Well done," Edmund said quietly. "You are removing only what is necessary, not cutting too deep. Remember this patience when errors occur. They are opportunities to practice correction with the same care you bring to initial writing." Peter nodded, his face showing both chagrin at the error and gratitude for the gentle instruction. Edmund returned to his desk, satisfied that the young monk was learning not just how to copy, but how to maintain quality through the inevitable mistakes that arose. Perfection was impossible, but the patient pursuit of excellence despite errors, that was achievable and worthy. By the time the bells rang for none, Edmund had completed several more pages, the manuscript growing steadily beneath his work-roughened hands. The fog had finally begun to lift, visibility improving to perhaps 50 yards, though the sun remained hidden behind layers of cloud. The afternoon office proceeded in its familiar rhythm, and afterward Edmund returned to the Scriptorium for the day's final hours of work. The section of the rule he was copying now discussed the qualities needed in monks who held various positions of responsibility within the community. Edmund found himself reflecting on his own role supervising the Scriptorium, considering how well he embodied the principles being described: patience, fairness, attention to individuals' varying capacities, leadership through example rather than command. The self-examination was not harsh, but honest, noting areas where he succeeded and areas where improvement remained possible. As evening approached, the fog had lifted sufficiently that the monastery buildings beyond the Scriptorium windows became visible, their stone walls darker where moisture still clung. Edmund worked until the natural light failed, then covered his manuscript and prepared the Scriptorium for the next day. The walk to Vespers took him through air that still held dampness, but no longer the thick obscurity of true fog, and he could see stars beginning to appear in gaps between clouds. The evening office, the meal, collatio, all proceeded in their established pattern. The abbot read from St. Gregory's dialogues, and Edmund listened with quiet attention, his mind peaceful after a day of concentrated work. When the great silence descended, he walked to his cell through darkness now clear, the fog having fully departed, leaving behind only dampness and the promise of clearer weather ahead. In his cell, Edmund knelt for his final prayers, offering gratitude for the day's steady progress, for hands that remained capable, for the privilege of copying words that had shaped countless lives across centuries. His work-roughened hands rested together, and the deep contentment that was his constant companion spread through him like warmth. Sleep came gently, carrying him into dreams of words and fog, of manuscripts emerging from whiteness like truth from obscurity, of patient work that made visible what had been hidden. Tuesday morning brought the clarity that fog's departure promised. Edmund woke to birdsong and pale dawn light. The world returned to its normal visibility, distances restored. He rose for vigils with a sense of anticipation, knowing this would be a good day for work, the clear light facilitating the careful attention that copying required. The night office proceeded in the church's familiar dimness, and afterward Edmund returned to his cell for brief sleep that was deep and restorative. After lauds and the morning meal, Edmund arrived at the Scriptorium to find sunlight streaming through the windows, creating the ideal conditions for manuscript work. He settled at his desk with a sense of pleasure, uncovering the Benedictine rule and resuming his copying with renewed energy. The pages flowed beneath his quill with particular smoothness, his hands seeming to know instinctively the proper pressure and angle, the rhythm established so firmly that conscious thought became unnecessary. Brother Martin completed his psalter during the morning, the final page finished with evident satisfaction. He brought the completed work to Edmund for inspection, and together they examined it carefully, checking for errors, assessing the overall quality, discussing which monk in the bindery would be best suited to creating covers worthy of the manuscript's quality. Edmund nodded his approval of Martin's work, recognizing in it the same patient dedication he himself brought to copying. "This is fine work," Edmund said, his voice warm with genuine praise. "The script is clear and consistent, the page layouts well proportioned. It will serve the community well for many years." Brother Martin's face showed quiet pleasure at the recognition, and he carried his completed manuscript to the library for temporary storage until binding could be arranged. Edmund watched him go, feeling satisfaction at having witnessed another project completed, another contribution to the monastery's collection of manuscripts. Young Brother Peter approached Edmund's desk during mid-morning, carrying his epistle pages. He had now completed 7 pages, and Edmund examined them carefully, noting continued improvement. The script was becoming more assured, letters forming with increasing fluidity, spacing developing natural consistency. Peter was progressing from conscious effort to unconscious competence, the transition that marked real skill development. "You are ready for longer sessions," Edmund observed. "Your hand is learning to maintain quality over extended time. This afternoon, try working for a full hour without break, maintaining the same careful attention throughout. This endurance is as important as the individual letters. Manuscripts require sustained concentration over days and weeks." Peter nodded understanding, and Edmund saw in the young monk's face both pride at progress acknowledged and determination to meet the new challenge. Teaching brought its own satisfactions, watching skill develop through patient instruction and diligent practice. The morning advanced toward midday, sunlight shifting across the Scriptorium floor, as the earth turned beneath the sun's steady gaze. Edmund's quill moved with unbroken rhythm, the Benedictine rule taking form page by page beneath his work-roughened hands. He had reached the section discussing the reception of guests, and found particular resonance in the instruction that all guests should be received as Christ himself, a principle that governed the monastery's approach to hospitality, evident in how the visiting prior had been welcomed the previous week. When the bells rang for sext, Edmund looked up with mild surprise, having been so absorbed that time had compressed. He had completed more pages than usual, the clear light and his focused concentration combining to facilitate rapid progress without sacrificing quality. He set down his quill and flexed his fingers, nodding with satisfaction that they showed no cramping despite the extended work. The midday office proceeded in its familiar rhythm, and Edmund found his attention particularly caught by one of the psalm verses. "This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." The words seem to speak directly to his experience. The gift of clear light, capable hands, meaningful work, all combining to create a day that was indeed cause for gladness. Not excitement or dramatic joy, but the quiet gladness that came from being exactly where one was meant to be, doing exactly what one was meant to do. The meal that followed featured fresh bread with honey, a treat that appeared occasionally when the monastery's bees had produced particularly well. Edmund savored the sweetness, the way it transformed ordinary bread into something approaching luxury. The simple pleasure reminded him that joy could be found in small things when approached with attention and gratitude. During the rest period, Edmund lay in his cell thinking about the manuscript's progress. He was now past the halfway point, perhaps 3/5 complete, with the remainder awaiting the coming day's steady attention. At his current pace, the work would be finished within 2 weeks, ready for binding and placement in the library. The thought brought satisfaction without urgency. The work would be completed when it was completed, no sooner and no later than the steady application of skill and attention determined. The afternoon in the Scriptorium brought continued copying, Edmund's quill moving with the same fluid rhythm that had characterized the morning. Brother Thomas had begun a new Illumination project, preparing materials with the careful attention that preceded all fine work. Young Brother Peter, following Edmund's instruction, worked for a full hour without break, his concentration holding steady, his script maintaining quality throughout. When the hour concluded, Edmund examined the results and nodded approval. Peter had met the challenge successfully. As afternoon advanced toward evening, Edmund found himself approaching the conclusion of the Benedictine rule's main body of teaching, the final chapters discussing various practical matters of monastic administration. These were less spiritually profound than earlier sections, but no less important. Communities required structure and clear guidelines to function smoothly, and Benedict's wisdom extended to these practical details as fully as to loftier theological matters. The bells for Vespers arrived as Edmund completed a particularly long chapter, and he covered his work with satisfaction at the day's substantial progress. The walk to the church took him through late afternoon light that had taken on spring's characteristic clarity, everything appearing sharp-edged and vividly colored. Inside the church, the evening office proceeded with its customary beauty, voices raised in prayer and praise as day transitioned toward night. After Vespers came the evening meal, and then collatio, where the abbot read from the conferences of John Cassian, discussing the different forms that prayer could take, sometimes words, sometimes wordless attention, sometimes simply resting in God's presence. Edmund listened with recognition, identifying in these ancient descriptions his own varied experiences of prayer across the decades. When the great silence descended, Edmund walked to his cell through evening air that held a mildness suggesting spring's firm establishment. The season was advancing steadily, each day bringing slightly longer light, slightly warmer temperatures, more visible growth in gardens and orchards. In his cell, Edmund knelt for his final prayers, offering gratitude for a day of particularly fruitful work, for the satisfaction of seeing substantial progress on the manuscript, for the simple gift of clear light and capable hands. Sleep came easily, his body tired from the day's concentration, his mind peaceful with accomplishment. He dreamed of pages turning, of words flowing like water, of manuscripts being read across centuries by hands he would never know, all connected by the patient work of copying that preserved and transmitted wisdom through time's endless progression. Wednesday morning arrived with continued clear weather, and Edmund woke with anticipation of another productive day. The familiar rhythm of vigils, lauds, and morning meal proceeded, and then he returned to the Scriptorium to resume his copying. The Benedictine rule was nearing completion now, only a few chapters remaining before the epilogue that concluded Benedict's teaching. The morning's work proceeded with particular smoothness, Edmund's hand moving almost automatically across the page, the text so familiar that his consciousness could rest in a state of peaceful absorption while his body performed the physical work. This state, neither fully present nor absent, awareness distributed between the words being copied, and a spacious interior quiet, was one of the aspects of manuscript work Edmund valued most. It was a form of meditation that required no special technique, arising naturally from sustained attention to repetitive skilled work. By midday, Edmund had reached the epilogue, Benedict's final words to his monks. The text spoke of the rule not as a burden but as a beginning, a foundation upon which to build a life of deeper devotion and service. Edmund copied these words with particular care, aware that they concluded a text he had lived by for decades, that they spoke to the very purpose of his existence within the monastery's walls. The afternoon brought the manuscript's completion. Edmund formed the final words with deliberate precision, then set down his quill and sat in stillness, looking at the finished work. Weeks of patient effort had produced this result, a clean, clear copy of the Benedictine rule that would serve the community for years, perhaps generations. The pages lay before him, ink dry and dark against pale vellum, each letter formed by his work-roughened hands, each word a small act of preservation and transmission. Brother Thomas approached to examine the completed manuscript, and they stood together in companionable silence, two craftsmen appreciating work well done. No words were necessary. The quality spoke for itself, and their shared understanding of what such work required created a bond that needed no verbal expression. The bells for none arrived, and Edmund covered the completed manuscript carefully before joining the community for the afternoon office. Walking to the church, he felt the satisfaction that came from seeing a long project through to completion, from knowing he had contributed something of value to the community's life and resources. The prayers that afternoon carried particular meaning, his gratitude for capable hands and sustained concentration finding expression in the ancient words of the Psalms. After none, Edmund returned to the Scriptorium not to work, but to prepare the manuscript for binding. He gathered the pages carefully, checking each one for any errors that might have escaped notice during copying, finding none that required correction. The work was sound, ready for the next phase of its transformation from loose pages to bound volume. He would deliver it to the bindery tomorrow, where skilled hands would create covers and stitch the pages securely together. With the manuscript complete and his primary project finished, Edmund turned his attention to other Scriptorium tasks. He He checked supplies, noting what needed replenishing. He examined stored manuscripts for any signs of damage or deterioration. He spent time with young Brother Peter, reviewing the epistle pages and offering detailed feedback on areas showing improvement and areas still needing attention. The afternoon passed peacefully in these varied tasks, Edmund moving from one responsibility to another with the unhurried attention he brought to all things. When Vespers arrived, he left the Scriptorium with a sense of completion, a chapter finished, ready for whatever work would come next. The evening proceeded in its familiar pattern: office, meal, collatio, the great silence. In his cell, Edmund knelt for his final prayers with particular gratitude, offering thanks for the completed manuscript, for weeks of steady work brought to fruition, for the privilege of contributing to something larger than himself. His work-roughened hands, ink-stained and marked by decades of holding quills, rested together, and the deep contentment that was his constant companion wrapped around him like a blessing. Sleep came gently, carrying him into dreams of completed works and new beginnings, of manuscripts finding their places in libraries where they would be read and consulted, of words preserved and transmitted forward into time, of patient work performed with love and attention bearing fruit in ways both seen and unseen, in his own time and in times beyond his knowing, all part of an endless chain of transmission that connected past to present to future in an unbroken flow of wisdom and care. Thursday morning brought Edmund to the bindery, carrying the completed Benedictine rule manuscript with careful reverence. Brother Gilbert, the monastery's master binder, received the pages with appreciation, his weathered hands examining the work with the experienced eye of someone who understood what quality copying required. They discussed the binding, simple but durable, leather covers over wooden boards, the monastery's seal impressed into the front cover. The manuscript would be ready in 10 days, Gilbert estimated, and Edmund nodded acceptance of this timeline. Returning to the Scriptorium, Edmund found himself in that particular space between projects, a pause that allowed for reflection and preparation. He spent the morning organizing materials, checking the condition of stored vellum, and mixing fresh batches of ink that would be needed in coming weeks. The work was simple and methodical, requiring attention but not the intense concentration that copying demanded, and his mind drifted peacefully while his hands performed familiar tasks. By afternoon, the abbot had selected Edmund's next project, a collection of homilies by St. John Chrysostom, sermons that would provide material for communal reading during meals and private study. Edmund received the assignment with quiet satisfaction, knowing the work would occupy him for months, the collection being extensive. He spent the remaining afternoon hours preparing pages and planning the manuscript's layout, the beginning stages that preceded actual copying. When Vespers arrived, Edmund walked to the church through late afternoon light that seemed particularly golden, spring having reached that moment of perfect balance between winter's memory and summer's approach. The evening office proceeded with its customary beauty, and Edmund's voice joined with his brother's, the ancient words carrying prayers and praise upward into the vaulted space above. After the evening meal and collation, the great silence descended once more. Edmund made his way to his cell through darkness, now warm enough to be pleasant rather than merely tolerable. The season's advance evident even in the quality of nighttime air. Stars showed brilliantly overhead, their ancient light reaching across vast distances to touch this small monastery in its Yorkshire valley. In his cell, Edmund knelt for his final prayers, offering gratitude for work completed and work yet to come, for the steady rhythm of prayer and labor that structured each day, for community that supported and sustained him, for the deep contentment that had been his companion through all the years of his vocation. His work-roughened hands rested together, ink stains visible even in candlelight, marks of service that he wore without pride or shame, simply as evidence of how he had chosen to spend the gift of time and skill. As he lay down to sleep, Edmund felt the familiar peace settling through him like warmth from a well-tended fire. Tomorrow would bring new pages to prepare, new words to copy, the endless work of preservation and transmission continuing as it had for centuries and would continue for centuries more. His contribution was small but genuine, each carefully formed letter a thread in an enormous tapestry being woven across time. Outside his window, the night continued its ancient passage toward dawn, stars wheeling slowly overhead, the monastery holding its community in sleep and prayer, and somewhere in the Scriptorium, vellum pages waited patiently for tomorrow's work, ready to receive whatever words his steady hands would inscribe upon them in the days and weeks and months ahead.